If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 71, Attitude and Speculation. Orion didn't argue. The killing curse really wasn't some impossibly advanced piece of magic. Its power depended far more on the caster's raw magical strength, and on how badly they truly wanted to kill. If someone hesitated, even if they managed to cast it, the effect would drop off sharply. At most, it might give the target a nosebleed. What Orion felt was curiosity, or maybe uncertainty. If I hadn't stopped you, he asked, would you really have killed him? Regulus looked at the cold wizard on the ground, still twitching, and stayed silent for a few seconds. On this, he decided to tell his father the truth. I'm not afraid to kill. But I wouldn't use the killing curse to do it. At least not right now. Killing with it is too obvious. Regulus raised his wand and studied it in front of his eyes. Especially with my own wand. That's trouble I don't need. Then he went on, voice even. Besides, there are too many ways to kill. Without magic, with physical force. Twist his neck. Drive something through his heart. Cut an artery. With magic, but not dark magic. Like I can use transfiguration to turn the air in his lungs into poison gas. Turn the blood in his vessels into mercury. And the environment makes it easy to set off explosives. Cause a collapse. Or don't do anything at all. Leave him here and someone will want test material eventually. Every time Regulus listed another method, Orion's eyes narrowed a fraction. He was trying to understand the thinking behind his son's words. See. It was a classic pureblood mindset, only clearer than most purebloods ever managed. Some pureblood families loved to talk about justice, as if their status and seats in the Wiesengamot had been earned through love and peace. Then if I hadn't shown up, Orion continued, what were you going to do with these people? Regulus turned his head and looked at his father. Instead of answering, he asked, does our family do business related to human bodies? Orion stared at him for a long moment before he finally said, we do. Nocturne Alley has 3 clinics and 2 alchemy labs. They need materials regularly. Mostly dark wizards, werewolves, and vampires. The kinds that aren't protected by the law. When he saw Regulus's expression didn't change, Orion added one more sentence. Sometimes muggles too. Regulus nodded. He didn't say anything else, but the meaning was obvious. Orion didn't press further. His son's attitude didn't surprise him. Orion wasn't afraid to kill either. As the head of the House of Black, as someone who'd navigated the highest circles of the wizarding world for decades, his hands couldn't possibly be clean. Those businesses in Nocturne Alley, some he allowed to exist. Some he controlled directly. Some he had even pushed into being. He just didn't want Regulus killing with his own hands so early. It had nothing to do with morality. It was psychological. The first time you kill is different from the 100th. The 100th is different from the 1000th. The first time leaves a mark. It carves something into the soul. Orion wanted Regulus to grow a little more first. He wanted him steadier, tougher inside, before he stepped over that line. But now, it seemed Regulus might have stepped over it long ago. Not because he'd actually killed someone, necessarily, but because of the way he understood the world. Maybe in Regulus's mind, killing wasn't sacred or taboo. It was simply an option. A tool. One way to solve a problem. Like using a knife to chop vegetables. Like boiling water over a flame. Natural, ordinary, and not something that needed meaning piled onto it. Orion couldn't decide whether that was good or bad. But Regulus could summon a patroness, so there was nothing to worry about. Orion took one last look at the 4 people on the ground and flicked his wand. 4 powerful stunning spells struck them squarely in the forehead, precise and clean, knocking them fully unconscious. Then he flicked his wand again, and the 4 bodies floated up and drifted after him. Come on, Orion called. Time to go home. They left the side alley and returned to the main street of Nocturne Alley. The foot traffic was still sparse. Everyone kept their heads down and hurried along. No one cared about the 4 unconscious bodies floating behind them. A few people glanced over, but the moment they spotted the black crest on Orion, they snapped their eyes away and pretended they hadn't seen anything. That was how Nocturne Alley worked. Mind your own business if you wanted to live longer. After tossing the 4 bodies into a shop, Orion stopped at the shadowed passage that led out of Nocturne Alley and said to Regulus, "Don't tell your mother about what happened today." Regulus looked over, baffled for a second, then nodded. Of course. And one more thing. Orion thought for a moment, then added, we come to Nocturne Alley a few times a year. From now on, you're coming with me. Watch more and learn more, but don't act too easily. Some things are better left as knowledge. You don't need to do them yourself. Understood. They walked out of the passage and stopped in front of the neat brick wall that marked Diagon Alley. Sunlight poured down, warm and bright. The air was clean. Children's laughter carried from somewhere nearby. Compared to Nocturne Alley's filthy gloom, this place felt like heaven. By the time they returned from Nocturne Alley to Grimmauld Place, it was already dark outside, and the fire in the hearth was roaring. Creaker took Orion's cloak the moment he removed it, then helped Regulus unfasten his own cloak clasp, quick and efficient. Dinner was served in the dining room. The long table was loaded with dishes Walburga had personally supervised. Golden roasted lamb chops. Escargot baked under a creamy sauce. A mountain of mashed potatoes. And Regulus's favorite, pumpkin pie. Candlelight flickered beneath the crystal chandelier, and the silverware threw back a soft gleam. Walburga sat at the head of the table, and her eyes never left Regulus. She watched him cut into the lamb with knife and fork. Watched him drink his soup. Watched him eat his pie. The look on her face, pride tangled with worry, was nearly overflowing. You go back to school tomorrow. Walburga sliced into her own lamb chop, her knife and fork clicking crisply against the china. Have you packed everything? Everything's packed. Regulus swallowed and looked up at her. Take care of yourself at school. Don't bury yourself in books. Walburga kept going, her concern obvious in her tone. You're still growing, so eat properly and sleep properly. Those classes aren't difficult for you. You don't need to push yourself to the bone. Then her tone shifted, sharper. Of course, you still need to fight for what's yours. A Black can't fall behind. If someone's too blind to know their place, teach them. Let them see what our family is capable of. Regulus listened quietly, nodding now and then. He was long used to his mother's contradictory instructions. One moment she worried he'd wear himself out, the next she demanded he uphold the family's pride without any slack. After dinner, Orion went to his study to handle paperwork. Regulus followed. When he knocked and stepped inside, Orion was standing by the window, looking out at the street. At the sound, he turned. Seeing Regulus, he pointed to the chair across from the desk. Sit. Regulus sat and arranged his thoughts. Father, he began without hesitation, I have some thoughts about the Malfoys. Orion returned to his chair behind the desk, fingers interlaced on the tabletop, and waited for him to continue. How is Abraxas Malfoy's health these days? Regulus asked. I saw him at a gathering not long ago. He seemed in good spirits. Orion's tone was measured. But he's getting older. There are always little problems. Why do you ask? It just occurred to me. Regulus kept his voice calm. If the elder Malfoy had an accident, an illness, an injury, or something worse, what happens to the Malfoy family? Orion narrowed his eyes. Did you hear something? No. Regulus shook his head. No rumors. It's a guess. Among pure-blood families, the Malfoys are riding the highest wave right now. The elder Malfoy is skilled. He's made their house thrive. But maybe that isn't entirely a good thing. Regulus watched his father's expression. When Orion didn't respond, he continued. Especially in the current situation. Voldemort needs loyal followers, not allies who are hard to control. A family that's too powerful, and too independent, might not fit what he wants. Orion leaned forward slightly. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm only speculating. Regulus shook his head again. Let's assume it happens. If the elder Malfoy truly goes down, who benefits most? Lucius would inherit the Malfoy family, but he's too young. He lacks experience. His methods don't come close to his father's. What does the Malfoy family become then? A wealthy house without enough strength or wisdom to match its fortune. A tool that's easier to control. Easier to use. He looked straight at Orion. Which Malfoy would Voldemort prefer? The elder Malfoy, clever but not fully controllable, or Lucius, an heir who can be pushed into place? The study fell silent. Orion's fingers tapped softly against the desk as he thought. Your speculation is dangerous, he said at last, and bold. Abraxas is Voldemort's public supporter. They've worked together for years. There's no reason. Chapter 72, Thought and the Second Inheritance. No reason. Regulus cut him off, tossing out his counterpoint like it was obvious. The primary conflict and the secondary conflict can switch places, and the main aspect of a contradiction can become the lesser one, and vice versa. Right now, the primary conflict might be purebloods versus half-bloods, but when we reach that stage, internal consolidation of power becomes the new primary conflict. Orion snapped his head up and stared at him. There was shock in that look, and confusion, and something complicated that didn't have an easy name. His lips moved. He looked like he wanted to say something, then swallowed it back down. After a long moment, he spoke at last. Even in the privacy of his study, his voice stayed low. "Where did you learn that?" This time Regulus was the one caught off guard. He hadn't expected Orion to know it at all. He'd only quoted it on instinct, because that theory was the cleanest way to explain his logic. He hadn't thought his father would understand it. "I read it somewhere." Regulus kept it vague. "Political philosophy. Some of it's interesting." Orion watched him for a long time. Finally, he shook his head, and something close to wonder crossed his face. "It is sharp," he said, his tone softer, edged with memory. "When I was young, I picked up a book in a Muggle bookshop by accident. Back then it just felt novel. Later, after I'd lived through more, I thought back on those ideas, and I understood why some people end up doing great things." A strange feeling rose in Regulus's chest. He hadn't expected that, not in this world, not in a black family that treated pureblood supremacy like scripture. The fact that his father had read those books, and more than that, had seen value in them. The thought flickered through him and was gone. Orion pulled the conversation back where it belonged. "How likely is your speculation?" "I don't know," Regulus said honestly. "Maybe 30%. Maybe 50%. But even if something like this has a 1% chance, you prepare as if it's certain. If Abraxas really does go down, it means the wind has shifted." "The wind?" Orion repeated, eyes narrowing slightly. "From cooperation to control," Regulus said. "From recruiting allies to eliminating anyone who won't fall in line. If the elder Malfoy dies, and it happens the way we're talking about, it becomes a signal. It tells every pureblood family there are only two choices. Total obedience, or you're out. No middle ground." Orion was silent for a long time. He went to the bookshelf, pulled out a heavy family genealogy, and turned to the pages that recorded the more recent web of alliances. His finger traced along the Malfoy entry, then stopped at the black line. "If it really is like you say," he asked at last, voice low and careful, "what do we do?" "We wait." Regulus didn't hesitate. "We wait for it to happen. We wait for Lucius to take over the Malfoy family. We wait until he feels the pressure, until he realizes money isn't enough, and he needs real allies. Then we move." He added, "Narcissa is my cousin. That connection exists. Malfoy and Black are natural allies already. It's just that while the elder Malfoy was alive, the two houses were more like equal partners. If it becomes Lucius, we can give him what he'll be missing." "And what is that?" Orion asked, even though he already knew where this was heading. "Wisdom, experience, strength, and connections," Regulus said. "And most importantly, how to keep a family alive when the storm hits. Lucius doesn't have that now, and it'll be hard for him to gain it on his own. We do." Orion closed the genealogy and returned it to the shelf. When he came back to the desk, he looked at Regulus with a faint, unmistakable edge of pride. "Lucius," Orion said slowly, "is clever and social. But like you said, he lacks his father's depth. He tends to act for immediate gain. He doesn't have the same patience for long games. From a family perspective, he hasn't done anything unforgivable, at least not publicly, but..." He continued, "Last year the Ministry of Magic had a proposal regarding magical creature protections. It should have passed. Lucius spent 10,000 galleons lobbying until it died. The reason was simple. Several families were smuggling those creatures, and they promised to let him in. And there was a Muggle-born Ministry employee up for a promotion. Lucius quietly put obstacles in the way until the man was forced to resign. No real reason. He just thought someone Muggle-born didn't deserve to climb that high." Orion shook his head. "These things aren't huge on their own, and in pure blood circles people even praise that sort of behavior as protecting your own, but pile up enough of it and it plants problems you can't see yet. Regulus nodded. Which is why he'll need allies even more. One person makes a mistake, they pay the price. A group makes the same mistake, the price spreads out. You understand this far too well, Orion said, still unsettled. He had no idea how his son had learned to think like this. Magic education couldn't cultivate it. This was pure intelligence. It had nothing to do with spells. By then, the conversation had reached a natural end. It was deep enough. Orion told him he would keep an eye on the Malfoys, and he'd start preparing accordingly. Then he said, "Go rest. School starts tomorrow." "All right." Regulus left the study and closed the door behind him. Back in his room, Regulus's thoughts felt off. The conversation had a taste to it. It stirred him in a way that almost never happened. He sat at his desk, closed his eyes, and let his awareness sink inward. The star-guided meditation began to turn. The vast image of it smoothed down the tangled edges of his mind. When his emotions finally settled, he opened his eyes and started thinking again. He'd said everything he could about the Malfoys. His father would handle the rest. What Regulus needed to focus on now was something concrete. Strength. There was half a day left of break, enough time to do one thing. To take a second inheritance. Verdant magic, the first inheritance, had given him direction, but it lacked immediate combat power. What he needed now was something that could take effect instantly in real fighting. Space magic suited that perfectly, and the Black family inheritance happened to contain exactly what he needed. The space anchor charm. Regulus stood and went to the family's hidden chamber. By now, he had access to most of the house. He moved through without resistance, pushed open the obsidian door, and stepped into the wide, solemn chamber. On the stone platform, more than a dozen memory crystal spheres reflected a faint silver sheen under the light of the magical torches. He touched the cold surface, and an immense flood of memory and magic poured straight into his mind. That ancestor had lived in the 14th century, an era when space magic research reached a peak. The space anchor charm she left behind was not an offensive spell, and not a defensive spell in the usual sense. It was stabilization magic for space itself. The principle was simple. You set invisible magical anchor points in the void, fixing the surrounding structure of space in place. It had two effects. First, it resisted apparition ambushes, though it worked differently from modern anti-apparition wards. Within the range of an anchor, space became unnaturally viscous. Forcing apparition into it was like jumping into cement that hadn't finished setting. Movement slowed dramatically, or the attempt failed entirely. Second, it stabilized spatial structure, pushing back against magic meant to twist, tear, expand, or fold space, reducing those effects to a fraction of what they should be. Regulus watched scenes from the ancestors' battles through the inheritance memory. In one, she faced a dark wizard who specialized in apparition strikes. She laid 3 space anchors around herself first. He tried to blink behind her for a kill, and the moment he appeared, his body locked in midair, trapped like he'd sunk into an invisible bog. She ended the fight with a single slashing curse, smooth as turning a page. In another scene, an enemy tried to shred her with spatial distortion, but the anchors held the surrounding structure steady. The distortion only took hold outside the anchored range, while she stood at the center, untouched. The inheritance memory lasted about half an hour. When Regulus finally pulled his fingers away, fine sweat dotted his forehead. Taking 2 inheritances in such a short time was a heavy strain. He could feel a dull pressure deep in his mind, as if his skull had been stuffed too full and needed time to settle. But he understood the core principle of the space anchors now. You used magic to tie a knot into the structure of space, making that area stable, solid, difficult to shake. Anchor positions could be chosen freely. The number of anchors could stack. The range could be adjusted. In theory, if you laid enough anchors, close enough together, you could create a domain where space magic simply didn't function. House elves would be restricted. Port keys too. Whether a phoenix could break it, he didn't know, but a starlight kite probably wouldn't manage it. Regulus left the chamber and returned to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the knowledge settle, slow and heavy. There was too much in his head right now. It would take time to sort it. Outside the window, London's night was calm. In the distance, Big Ben struck 10. The sound came through the magical barrier, muffled and long. Regulus lay back and closed his eyes. The last few days replayed in his mind. Nocturne Alley's gloom. The test of real combat. His talk with his father. The second inheritance. Every piece of it pushed him forward. Every piece of it added to his strength. Break was over. Tomorrow, he went back to Hogwarts. Chapter 73, Thestrals and the Start of Term. The Hogwarts Express pulled into the station at 4 in the afternoon. Regulus stepped off the train with his trunk, and the platform was packed with students returning to school. The noise hit him like a wave. He headed for the carriages with Cuthbert and Alex. The carriages looked like they were moving on their own. The front was empty, no animal in sight, but Regulus knew what was there. Thestrals. He couldn't see them. Only people who had witnessed death could see a Thestral, and Regulus had never watched someone die. So all he saw was empty harness shafts, and a carriage that rolled along the gravel path by itself, the wheels creaking over stone. It felt like a shame. Thestrals carried a special weight in magical texts. They could fly. They could cut through storms and darkness. They could slip past magical barriers. Some books even claimed they could briefly traverse space itself. More than that, they were symbolic. Only someone who had faced death, who had accepted the truth of life, could see them. Maybe that was the point. Break through the limits of what you think you know, gain a deeper understanding, and you start noticing what other people can't. In the wizarding world, symbols and images sometimes were magic. Regulus climbed into a carriage. Several Slytherin students were already inside. The moment Cuthbert sat down, he started talking, his voice pitched a little louder on purpose, loud enough for everyone to hear. You lot wouldn't believe the Malfoy gathering over break. His face wore that look of someone who knew a secret he couldn't quite share, eyes bright. So many families were there. It was massive. Lucius Malfoy hosted personally. The elder Malfoy was there too, only showed his face and left, but still. Every word screamed the same message. I was at something important. As he spoke, he kept glancing at Regulus, like he wanted approval and also wanted to show off that he belonged in the same circle. Regulus listened quietly, nodding now and then. Hermes sat in the corner without a word. He looked even darker than he had before the break, pale, with faint shadows beneath his eyes. Everything about him said, "Don't come near me." Alex sat beside Regulus, listening to Cuthbert, and his face had gone a little white. He hadn't attended the gathering. He was only a branch of the Rosier family, but he still had a sense of what that kind of event meant. Purebloods choosing sides. Voldemort's influence consolidating. Hearing Cuthbert describe the details made fear crawl up his spine. Regulus noticed the way a few older students looked at Cuthbert, their eyes edged with contempt. None of them said anything. They simply looked away and pretended to be interested in the view outside. Regulus understood. It wasn't that they didn't want to speak. They were older, which meant they were better at hiding what they thought. In private, they might talk even more eagerly than Cuthbert ever would. The carriage passed through the Hogwarts gates, followed the long drive, and finally stopped in front of the castle. Students streamed out and walked into the brightly lit Great Hall. The start of term feast was already underway. The long tables were piled with food. The ceiling had been transfigured into a starry sky. Candles floated overhead, casting warm light. Dumbledore sat at the center of the staff table, his long silver beard gleaming in the candlelight. Once everyone had settled, Dumbledore stood. "Welcome back," he said, his voice warm and carrying easily across the hall. "Did you enjoy your holiday? I hope you've all had a proper rest, because there's a great deal of work ahead of us." His gaze swept across the 4 house tables, and wherever it landed, the room quieted. "Learning magic isn't only about mastering spells," Dumbledore continued. "It's also about understanding our relationship with the world. Why do we use magic? For what purpose? For whose benefit? Those are questions I hope you'll think about as you study." He raised his goblet. "To a new year, to the pursuit of knowledge, and to the things that make us better people. Cheers." A chorus of cheers rose around the hall. Regulus lifted his pumpkin juice and took a sip. Dumbledore wasn't being subtle. The message was clear. Magic had a higher purpose than showing off, higher than pride, higher than family glory. He was planting ideas about kindness, justice, responsibility. Regulus ate his roast chicken in silence. He understood Dumbledore's position, and he respected the man's stubborn commitment to it. But Regulus had his own path to walk. That path might not match Dumbledore's hopes, and that was fine. Everyone answered for their own choices. After the feast, students returned to their common rooms. In the Slytherin common room, silver and green decorations caught the firelight and threw back a cold gleam. Narcissa stood near the fireplace talking with a few seventh-year girls. When she saw Regulus enter, she gave him a small nod. Regulus walked over. "Cousin." "Regulus." Narcissa smiled. "How was your holiday?" "Not bad," Regulus said. "I met a lot of people. Learned a few new things." They traded a few brief pleasantries, all surface level, all polite. Then Lucretius Burke approached. The Slytherin prefect wore immaculate robes and a practiced smile. He bowed slightly to Narcissa first. "Apologies for the interruption, Narcissa. May I borrow Regulus for a moment?" Narcissa nodded. "Of course." Then she turned away with her usual graceful ease. Lucretius led Regulus to a quieter corner of the room. "I saw you in Nocturne Alley during the holiday," Lucretius said without preamble, voice lowered like he was sharing something private. "With your father? Inspecting the shops?" Regulus nodded, saying nothing. He hadn't been trying to hide. Being spotted was normal. "Next time you go, you should stop by my family's shop," Lucretius offered. "Borgin and Burke's, Nocturne Alley 13B. There are things you might find interesting." Regulus understood. The Burkes were extending goodwill. Not exactly recruitment, more like planting a favorable connection. With the elder Burke's reputation, it made sense. And Borgin and Burke's was one of the biggest dark artifact dealers in Nocturne Alley. There would be plenty worth seeing. "I will," Regulus said without hesitation. "Over break." Lucretius smiled, patted Regulus's shoulder, and walked away. Regulus stayed where he was, a thought slipping through his mind. He wondered if the vanishing cabinet was already in the Burke shop. The pair of cabinets that would one day connect Hogwarts and Nocturne Alley would become an important piece on the board. But it was too early for that. Draco Malfoy hadn't even been born yet. Regulus wasn't in a hurry. By the time he returned to the dormitory, it was nearly 11. Cuthbert was still excitedly telling Alex about his holiday, even though Alex very clearly didn't want to hear it. Hermes had already drawn his bed curtains shut. A faint, unstable pulse of magic leaked through. Regulus glanced once and recognized it for what it was. Dark magic, but not the darkest kind. Regulus didn't join the conversation. He washed up and went straight to bed. He closed his eyes and let his awareness sink deep. Star-guided meditation began to turn. The 4 stars of Orion lit up in his mind, silver-white, tracing the constellation's outline. Magic flowed in a looping cycle along the path of those stars. But tonight felt different. A dull pressure throbbed in the depths of his awareness, like his head was too full, like his mind hadn't finished digesting what he'd taken in. Taking 2 inheritances back-to-back had strained him more than he'd expected. Verdant magic demanded an understanding of life's essence. The space anchor charm demanded control over spatial structure. Both were advanced magic, both required a vast foundation of knowledge and extremely precise manipulation. All of that information had crashed into his consciousness like floodwater. It would take time to absorb, to understand, to integrate. Regulus could feel it clearly. If he tried to take a 3rd inheritance now, it would probably fail. His mind was close to saturation. Forcing more ancestral memory into it could mean confusion and tangled understanding at best, and real mental damage at worst, memories shifting out of place. Time between inheritances was necessary. His ancestors hadn't sealed a lifetime of knowledge into crystal so their descendants could swallow it all in one bite. That was like trying to eat a year's worth of food in a single meal. You wouldn't survive it. Inheritance required digestion. It required practice. It required turning someone else's experience into your own understanding. There was no rushing that process. Regulus adjusted his meditation, easing the flow of magic into something gentler. He stopped chasing speed. Instead, he focused on consolidation. The 4-star model needed to be steadier. Magic circulation needed to be smoother. His mental barriers needed to be stronger. Once his mind fully recovered, once verdant magic and the space anchor charm had both settled into him properly, then he would try to light the 5th star of the star-guided meditation. That would be a new breakthrough. But that was for later. For now, he needed rest. A new school year had begun. Chapter 74, A Small Charm, A Big Spark. At breakfast, Cuthbert was still going on about his holiday like he'd been paid by the word. He waved his fork around as he described the size of Malfoy Manor's ballroom, the enchanted murals on the ceiling that shifted patterns, and the delicate little pastries the house elves served, the kind with names you couldn't even pronounce. Alex kept his head down beside him, listening, occasionally chiming in with a question like he was trying to be polite. Hermes only ate, his knife and fork tapping softly against his plate. Regulus chewed his toast slowly, and for once his mind felt slightly distant. The holiday days sat behind a thin veil, clear and vivid, and yet far away. The Malfoy dinner. The pure blood gathering. Those meaningful, carefully chosen words he'd exchanged with Lucius Malfoy on the terrace. The places he'd walked through while inspecting the family's businesses. The short, clean fight in one of Nocturne Alley's dark side streets. It had all happened in a single break. He'd done those things with an adult's mindset. He'd thought about those problems like an adult, handled those relationships like an adult. Then he'd turned around and come back to Hogwarts, sitting in classes as a first year. On the Gryffindor side, James Potter was loudly telling the table about racing Sirius on broomsticks over the holiday, while Peter Pettigrew sat beside him with a face full of envy, asking question after question. Over at Ravenclaw, a few girls were comparing the colors of the hair ribbons they'd bought. Some Hufflepuff boys were complaining about homework, swearing they'd barely managed to finish. And at the Slytherin table, aside from Cuthbert's show-off storytelling, everyone else was talking too. Who had a new broom? Who had gone to France and what they'd eaten? Who had picked up some odd little trinket in Nocturne Alley? The topics were small, ordinary, threaded with childish excitement and childish grumbling. Regulus suddenly found it all interesting. That pure attention to little details. The easy curiosity about something new. The honest chase of simple happiness. He hadn't felt that in a long time. Long enough that he'd nearly forgotten he was only 11. The first class of the new term was Charms. Professor Flitwick stood on top of his stack of books and announced the day's lesson in his high, bright voice. Rictus Empra. A fun little charm that forces the corners of your opponent's mouth up until they're laughing. It isn't harmful, but if you use it well, it can disrupt someone's casting. It's hard to speak an incantation properly while you're laughing. He demonstrated the wand movement and pronunciation, then flicked his wand. A pink beam shot toward the practice dummy on the front table. The dummy's wooden face immediately twisted into an exaggerated grin, as if it were silently cackling. Now, pair up and practice. Regulus was paired with Cuthbert. It really was a small charm. Plenty of first years had learned it before term even started, so there wasn't much difficulty. Cuthbert managed it on his first try. The dummy's mouth pulled into a grin, but not very wide, like a forced smile. On the wooden face, it looked faintly unsettling. When Regulus cast, the pink light snapped out from his wand tip, and the dummy's mouth stretched almost to its ears, the whole face warped into a ridiculous, manic laugh. Perfect. Professor Flitwick bounced up from his cushion. Precise casting, stable effect. Slytherin gains 5 points. Regulus nodded politely in thanks, but he didn't feel much. He'd known the charm for ages. He couldn't even remember where he'd picked it up, maybe a book, maybe watching another young witch or wizard practice. It had simply stuck. It was simple, low on magical demand, and the result was immediate. A classic beginner prank charm. Still, since it was class and the professor was teaching it, Regulus practiced properly. After a while, his mind began to drift. Then a thought surfaced, sudden and sharp. Regulus lowered his wand. When Professor Flitwick's patrol brought him near their table, Regulus raised his hand. A few Slytherins and Ravenclaws nearby immediately leaned in, ears pricking. Regulus Black asking a question on the first day back was not something they wanted to miss. Professor, Regulus said politely, respectful, I have a question about Rictus Empra. Professor Flitwick stepped closer and looked up at him with curiosity. Yes, Mr. Black. Does it only work on humans? It works on most living creatures, Flitwick replied. Mammals, birds, even some reptiles. But certain magical creatures have very strong resistance, and a small charm like this might not take. Of course, it depends. If the caster is skilled and powerful enough, the charm can affect most beings. Flitwick clearly thought that was the end of it. Regulus did not. What if the target doesn't have a mouth? Regulus asked, calm and steady. Or what about creatures where the mouth and the waist opening are the same hole, like Nidarians, jellyfish, sea anemones, corals. How would the charm apply then? The classroom went quiet. What kind of question was that? Why would something share one hole for both? Some students stared at each other, blank and confused. A few Ravenclaws frowned like they were honestly trying to work it out. A handful of Slytherins looked like they wanted to laugh and didn't dare. Professor Flitwick blinked, visibly caught. He pushed his glasses up his nose, thought carefully, and answered with caution. That is, a very creative question. As far as I know, no one casts Rictus Empra on Nadarians. In theory, if a target doesn't have a clear mouth structure, the charm may not be able to lock on, or its effect would be greatly reduced, or it might fail entirely. Then what about earthworms? Regulus asked. They have a mouth and an anus, but they're tiny openings on the body. Or slugs, where the mouth is on the underside and very small. Or deep-sea fish where the mouth is in a strange place, or where it doesn't exist in any traditional sense. Mr. Black, Professor Flitwick interrupted gently, with the tone of someone offering a warning without embarrassment. The examples you're raising are not ones many people study. Charms focuses on what works on humans and common magical beings. For specialized anatomy, the spell might need adjustments before it functions properly. Regulus nodded. Understood, Professor Flitwick. Thank you. Flitwick gave him a look that carried a bit more meaning than usual. You're welcome, Mr. Black. Questions are always welcome in my classroom. Regulus wasn't actually fascinated by which end of an Nadarian counted as a mouth. That kind of curiosity didn't have much practical value beyond being strange. The point was what the charm had sparked in his mind. Rictus Empra, from the moment it was created, had been built to force the corners of a target's mouth into a grin they couldn't control. Whoever designed it hadn't been thinking about jellyfish. They hadn't been thinking about earthworms or slugs. They probably hadn't been thinking about anything beyond humans at all. The charm had one purpose. One effect. There was no visible principle in the middle. No complex analysis of magical structure. No deep study of physiology. No explanation of how nerves and muscles controlled a smile. It was simply this. Someone had thought, I want to make people laugh. And somehow, through instinct, or inspiration, or endless trial and error, they found a way to shape magic into that result. Then the charm spread. It was written into textbooks. Taught and learned, generation after generation. A charm's text would list the wand movement. The pronunciation. The cautions. Maybe even variations and advanced uses. But it would not tell you why that movement paired with those syllables created that effect. Because no one knew, or because the number of people who knew was so small that the knowledge became secret, or it vanished into history. And through a tiny, silly charm, Regulus understood something all at once. Magic could not always be understood, not in the way he wanted. Until now, he'd tried to treat magic like science. Like reason. Like logic. Magic was energy. Spells were code. Wand movements were guidance. Effects were output. A precise program. That mindset had let him learn a huge number of spells quickly. He could even improve them, optimize them, invent new applications. But some magic might never have worked like that in the first place. The patroness charm demanded positive emotion. It demanded the most genuine desire buried in your heart. A patroness wouldn't appear because you understood the chemistry of happiness, or could define protection in philosophical terms. It appeared because you truly felt it, because you truly wanted to protect something. That was the power of the mind. The projection of will. Something more basic, more direct, more driven by belief than logic. Rictus Empra, small as it was, might be the same. The person who created it hadn't overthought it. They'd wanted to make someone laugh, and they'd done it. The person learning it didn't need to overthink it either. Chapter 75, Flitwick is a good professor bonus. When the bell rang, Professor Flitwick stopped Regulus before he could follow the others out. Mr. Black, could you stay a moment? Students filed past in a steady stream. Cuthbert glanced at Regulus, mouthed I'll wait outside, then slipped out with the rest. In no time at all, the classroom was empty except for the two of them. Professor Flitwick hopped down from his stack of books and walked over. He tilted his head up to look at Regulus, who towered over him, and the usual bright, bouncy excitement was gone from his face. In its place was something serious and intent. Your question today, Professor Flitwick said, reminded me of the question you asked in your very first lesson. About the nature of Wingardium Leviosa. About the way magic distributes, and how it supports something against gravity. Regulus dipped his head slightly and listened without interrupting. Back then, you were looking for principles. For the why. Professor Flitwick's voice stayed calm and measured. Today, you were still asking why, but from a different angle. You weren't asking how the spell works. You were asking what it doesn't work on. That's deeper thinking. That's progress in understanding. He kept his gaze fixed on Regulus, and behind his glasses, his eyes seemed to catch the light. Magic is simply there, Mr. Black, Professor Flitwick said, his voice turning softer, like he was sharing something old and carefully guarded. It has existed since ancient times, like air, like water, like the earth itself. Everyone understands magic differently. In the same school, with the same professor, using the same textbook, students can still grow into completely different paths. Some excel in combat magic. Some in healing. Some in transfiguration. Some in alchemy. None of those paths is better or worse. They're choices. His bright eyes didn't waver. But there is one thing they all share: you have to believe. Believe that magic exists. Believe in your understanding. Believe in the power of the mind. Because sometimes magic blooms when you least expect it, and answers when you need it most. That answer isn't always rational. It isn't always logical. But it's real. Regulus stood still, and something inside him loosened. The thin haze of confusion he'd been carrying began to peel away. Professor Flitwick noticed immediately. This small professor, a master of charms with decades of research and teaching behind him, had seen the shift in Regulus before Regulus could fully name it himself. From pure, cold analysis, to the first real acceptance that magic had an irrational side. From trying to force everything into a neat scientific framework, to understanding that some things might simply refuse to be explained. So Flitwick gave him this. Not a technique. Not a tidy answer. Something more fundamental, a way of approaching magic. Regulus had, at the start, been thoroughly rational. He'd always looked at the world the same way: gather information, compare it, find patterns, build models. Even with magic, his instincts pushed him to drag it into a framework that could be understood, tested, and explained. Everything had cause and effect. Everything could be solved. But the more magic he encountered, the wider the world became, and he'd started to see the cracks in that certainty. Magic could follow rules, yes. It could also be full of accidents and wonders. Transfiguration dealt with changing the very nature of matter. Soul magic brushed against the deepest mysteries of existence. The patroness charm went straight to the most buried desire in your heart. None of that could be reduced to a simple equation of energy conversion. Even so, he'd still leaned toward logic. He kept trying to find the hidden structure underneath it all, the unified framework that would make even the most seemingly spiritual parts of magic fall neatly into place. Right up until the moment he'd summoned a patroness. The starlight kite. In that instant, it had been pure sensation, pure certainty. Standing on a cliff along the Irish coast, watching the sun sink into the sea, feeling that rush in his chest, that longing for freedom, for a wider world, for endless possibility. And then the patroness had come, as naturally as if it had grown out of his soul. That was the first time he'd truly touched the strength of the mind. He'd chosen, after that, to walk a road where reason and feeling could exist together. Use logic to plan the direction. Use emotion to live the journey. Use calculation to control magic. Use the heart to feel it. Now, hearing Professor Flitwick speak, it felt like the final piece clicking into place. Magic was simply there. No matter how he looked at it, no matter what road he took toward it, whether he tried to understand it or simply experience it, magic was still there. It didn't change because he understood more. It didn't shrink because he chose one approach over another. It existed as naturally as the world itself. He could study it like science. He could sense it through the mind. He could grasp it by instinct. He could master it through experience. None of those paths contradicted the others. They weren't at war. They were different routes toward the same destination. What mattered was that he trusted the road he was walking, and treated magic with sincerity. Regulus drew a deep breath, then bowed to Professor Flitwick, properly and solemnly, with genuine respect. "Thank you, Professor," he said, voice steady and honest. "That meant a lot to me." Professor Flitwick smiled, and the lively sparkle returned to his face like a lamp being lit. "It's my honor to help you, Mr. Black." He sounded almost cheerful again. "You're talented, and you think in interesting ways. Keep thinking, keep your curiosity, but also keep yourself open. The magical world is vast. There's a great deal waiting for you to discover." Regulus thanked him once more and left the classroom. Cuthbert and Alex were waiting in the corridor. The moment Regulus appeared, Cuthbert leaned in eagerly. "What did he say to you?" "Just, something about understanding magic," Regulus said. "Oh." Cuthbert looked like he understood about half of that, and wisely didn't press. The three of them headed for their next class. Regulus walked in the middle, steps even, expression calm. But inside, that stubborn obsession he'd always carried, the need to trap everything inside a rational box, had finally begun to loosen for real. He was grateful to Professor Flitwick. Not only for the insight, but because Flitwick had been able to see the problem in his student, understand the confusion underneath it, and willingly share his own wisdom and experience. That attention, that willingness to guide, that respect for teaching itself, made Professor Flitwick someone genuinely admirable. Power mattered. Skill mattered. But a heart that wanted to lead students forward, a heart that didn't hoard knowledge, mattered too. The next class was History of Magic. Professor Binns drifted at the front of the room, lecturing in his flat, unchanging voice about medieval European wizard councils. Most students were fighting sleep. A few were secretly reading other books under their textbooks. Regulus sat near the window, quill in hand, drawing absent lines across parchment without realizing it. Professor Flitwick's words kept echoing. "Magic is simply there. Everyone understands magic differently. Believe in the power of the mind." They were enlightening, but they weren't absolute. Regulus wasn't the type to change his entire path because a professor had said something meaningful. He wouldn't swallow someone else's perspective whole and call it his truth. His road was his to walk. Every accomplished witch and wizard had their own understanding, their own way forward. Like Dumbledore, Grindelwald, Voldemort, Professor McGonagall, Professor Slughorn, Professor Flitwick. Their paths weren't just different, sometimes they clashed outright, yet every one of them had reached remarkable heights. You couldn't become someone like that by memorizing textbooks alone. You needed your own thinking. Your own understanding. Sometimes even your own creation. He could learn from other people's experience, borrow their methods, but he couldn't copy them entirely. That would be their road, not his. What Professor Flitwick had given him wasn't so much a direction as a confirmation. Confirmation that the way he'd been thinking lately was right. That reason and feeling could coexist. That accepting magic's irrational side wasn't regression, but growth. It made him more certain, not less. When the bell rang, Regulus packed his books and stood. He declined Cuthbert's invitation to go to the Great Hall for lunch, and instead turned toward the library. On the first day back, the library was quiet. Most students were still riding the warmth of the holiday break, preferring to stroll outside the castle and chat, or head back to their common rooms to trade stories. Regulus walked between the shelves until he reached the charms section. He didn't have a specific target. He just moved slowly along the spines, fingertips brushing titles as his eyes schemed over names, some new, some worn. Common spells and their variations. Advanced techniques in magical control. Ancient runes and their links to modern spells. In the end, he pulled out a book called On the Nature of Magic, written by an author he'd never heard of. He opened it. No matter which path he chose, he still had to walk it with his own feet. All the thinking in the world, all the understanding in the world, still had to land somewhere real, concrete knowledge, actual practice, and the steady growth of power. Professor Flitwick's words were guidance on direction. But how to walk it, how quickly, what to do when he hit an obstacle, that was on him. He sank into the book, and time slipped by. About half an hour later, the chair across from him scraped back. Someone sat down. Chapter 76, The Amazing Rabbit Bonus. Regulus looked up and found Lily across from him. She had a few books hugged to her chest, her hair pulled into a ponytail, and that bright, lively smile she always seemed to carry with her. Regulus gave her a small nod as greeting, then dropped his gaze back to his reading. Lily didn't seem bothered. If anything, she'd gotten used to him by now. She sat down quietly, pulled out a quill and parchment from her bag, and started writing. They didn't talk. There was only the soft flip of pages, and the scratch of a quill moving over parchment. The silence held until lunch was close. Regulus closed his book and began to stand, ready to head to the Great Hall. Lily packed up at the same time. She hesitated, then reached into the small shoulder bag Regulus had given her, the one with the extension charm, and pulled out a parcel. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a dark green ribbon. "For you." Lily pushed it toward him. Her voice was light, a little shy. "A late Christmas present. Don't make fun of it." Regulus took it, and the moment it touched his hands, he could tell it was knitted, soft and thick. Probably a scarf or gloves. The wrapping was simple, nothing like the fancy displays in shops, but the ribbon was tied neatly, and every corner had been folded with careful precision. He could picture her back in Cokeworth, sitting near the fireplace, knitting it stitch by stitch. She'd probably had to dodge Petunia's curious, maybe jealous looks. Dodge her parents' questions too. Finish her homework first, then work under lamplight at night until it was done. It wasn't expensive. The wool was ordinary, the pattern basic, and any shop could sell something prettier. But it carried something that couldn't be bought. Time and care. A girl's honest wish for a friend. Regulus accepted the parcel as if it mattered, then looked her in the eyes. "Thank you." Lily's face immediately lit up. The tension and awkwardness vanished, replaced by pure happiness. "I'm glad you like it," she said, suddenly cheerful. "I didn't have much to do at home, and I couldn't practice magic, so I thought I'd make something." They left the library together and started toward the Great Hall, chatting about the holiday as they walked. Regulus obviously wasn't about to tell Lily what his break had really been. The Malfoy dinner. The patrol through Nocturne Alley. Fighting dark wizards. None of that belonged in casual conversation. So he kept it safe. Practicing magic at home, attending the occasional social event. Lily listened with open envy. "You can practice at home. I don't even dare keep my wand near me. I'm terrified I'll do magic by accident. One time I was helping my mom wash dishes and there was this stubborn stain. My brain just went straight to scour Jiffy, and I panicked so bad I locked my wand in the deepest drawer." "The trace only flags underage magic when there aren't adult wizards nearby," Regulus said, following her line of thought. "If you really need practice over the holidays, find a close friend who has adult witches or wizards at home. Stay with them for a few days. If there are adults around, the trace won't trigger." "Really?" Lily's eyes brightened. "That works. The Ministry of Magic's system isn't that precise," Regulus explained. "It's mainly aimed at children from Muggle families, to keep them from exposing magic in front of Muggles. If there are adult wizards nearby, the system assumes the adults are the ones casting. It won't pin it on the kid." Lily nodded and clearly filed the information away. Then she hesitated, and asked anyway, "Why did you give me something so expensive?" "That bag. I saw similar ones in Diagon Alley. The price was terrifying." Regulus went quiet for a moment. He couldn't exactly tell her, "It only feels expensive to you, I thought it was cheap." "Value is relative," he said at last. "To me, it's just a convenient tool. The undetectable extension charm used to make it isn't that advanced. The Ministry of Magic bans private use, but as long as you're not showing off and you're not using it for anything illegal, you can do it quietly without trouble." Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he added, "If you're interested, the library has a book called Foundations and Applications of Spatial Magic. It explains the undetectable extension charm in detail, with practice methods. In theory, if your control is precise enough and you understand how space expansion works, you can make one yourself." Lily stared. "I can make one?" "Of course." Regulus nodded without hesitation. "Magic is learned. If you're willing to spend the time, and you practice seriously, a lot of things that look impossible are actually not that hard." He'd seen it in another life, in another story. Hermione Granger had managed to create a beaded bag with an extension charm in 7th year, packed with everything they needed to survive. If Hermione could do it, there was no reason Lily couldn't. Being younger didn't matter either. If Lily wanted, Regulus could guide her through the key points. They entered the Great Hall and split off toward their house tables. When Regulus sat down, Cuthbert leaned in and asked in a low voice, "You and that Evans girl close or something?" "Academic discussion," Regulus answered simply. Cuthbert made a face and dropped it. From the perspective of a boy raised in a pure-blood family, getting too friendly with someone Muggleborn was a bad idea. But he didn't dare interfere too much in anything Regulus did. A warning was the most he would risk, and even that was just duty as a housemate. Regulus didn't care. Most pure-blood children weren't even half as capable as Lily was. Wednesday afternoon brought Transfiguration. Professor McGonagall stood at the front of the classroom, as severe as ever. She wore a dark green robe, a Gryffindor badge and the Hogwarts crest pinned at the collar. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it looked like it had never once dared to move out of place. "Today's lesson is Handkerchief to Rabbit," she said, voice crisp and firm. "This is a key topic for the term, and it will appear on your final exam. The requirement is simple. Your rabbit must hold its form for 10 minutes without reverting." She picked up a white handkerchief and tapped it lightly with her wand. The fabric twisted, swelled, and stretched. A faint texture like fur rippled across the surface, and the edges began to lengthen into the shape of ears. A few seconds later, a living white rabbit sat on the desk. Its pink nose twitched, long ears upright, back feet giving a soft little kick against the tabletop. "Transfiguration relies on more than magic," Professor McGonagall said. "It relies on focus. You must clearly imagine every detail of the target form. The texture of the fur. The distribution of muscle. The structure of the skeleton. Even the color of the eyes, and the way they reflect light. The clearer your image, the more stable your transformation, and the longer it will hold." She tapped again. The rabbit became a handkerchief once more. "Now, begin." Regulus picked up the handkerchief in front of him. It was cotton, with the Hogwarts crest embroidered at the edge. He closed his eyes and built the rabbit in his mind. Not a vague outline, but something complete, precise, and layered, from the inside out. The skeletal system, which includes skull, spine, ribs, the shape of the limb bones, how each joint connected. The muscle system, like which muscles powered a jump, which controlled chewing, which turned the ears. The internal organs like heart placement, lung size, intestine length. External traits like fur length and density, the clarity of the eyes and their sheen, the fine pattern of blood vessels in the ears, the sensitivity of the whiskers. It came easily to him, effortless, but he knew it wasn't like that for everyone else. Some of the other first years probably didn't even know whether rabbits had tails. When the image was done, Regulus lifted his wand and tapped lightly. The handkerchief began to change. But unlike Professor McGonagall's smooth, natural transition, Regulus's was more precise, more layered, almost surgical. The transformation started from within. The cotton fibers rearranged, forming the beginnings of a skeleton. Then muscle tissue formed, wrapping around bone. Then organs appeared, settling into the correct places in chest and abdomen. Only after that did the fur grow in, white fluff spreading across the surface until the body was fully covered. It took about 5 seconds. A white rabbit stood on the desk, almost identical to the one Professor McGonagall had produced. If you looked closely, though, the difference was obvious. This rabbit's eyes were brighter, more alert. Its breathing looked more natural, the rise and fall of its chest steady and real. When its ears turned, you could almost hear the faint rub of cartilage. Regulus paused, considering. Then he tapped his wand again, aiming at the rabbit, and continued the transformation. The skin along the rabbit's back began to rise. Tissue reorganized beneath it. Bone extended. Muscle attached. A pair of wings pushed out from the shoulder blades, bat-like membrane wings. The wing bones were long and fine, joints flexible. The membrane was thin but tough, webbed with delicate veins. At the same time, the chest structure shifted. Ribs expanded outward to make room for new flight muscles. The heart adjusted slightly, pumping more efficiently. The lungs grew larger, built for stronger exchange of air. The hind leg muscles changed too, better suited for launch and landing. It still looked like a rabbit. But inside, it was something else entirely. Students around him gasped. Black made a magical creature. A Hufflepuff boy shouted. "Is that even a rabbit? Rabbits don't have wings." "It's definitely a magical creature, only magical creatures look like that." Chapter 77, A Livelier Regulus Bonus. This Transfiguration class was shared with Hufflepuff, so both houses crowded in to watch. Cuthbert sat beside Regulus, looking unbearably proud. Alex looked both stunned and impressed, eyes wide like he couldn't blink. Hermes made a face, but his gaze kept flicking over anyway. A few Hufflepuffs wore complicated expressions, equal parts envy, curiosity, and something that looked suspiciously like greed. Professor McGonagall strode over. She took one look and saw straight through it. "This is not a magical creature," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. "Transfiguring a magical creature involves changes at the deepest level. It requires going beyond standard transfiguration, and that is an advanced field. At your current level, it's impossible." She studied the winged rabbit closely, and there was the faintest hint of approval in her eyes. "Mr. Black has only altered this rabbit's existing physiology," Professor McGonagall continued. "He added flight organs and adjusted the related muscles and skeletal structure. The transformation itself is not especially advanced, but it does require a very thorough understanding of the target form. You must know what a rabbit's normal structure is. You must know how to modify it without destroying the overall balance. You must know how to keep it alive after the modification." She looked at Regulus. "Very good transfiguration. Precise control, sound structure, and an imaginative result. Slytherin gains 10 points for creative transfiguration." "Thank you, Professor," Regulus said politely. Professor McGonagall nodded and moved on to help the other students. But as she turned away, a fleeting expression crossed her face, almost confused. She had the odd sense that this black boy felt livelier. Not in personality, she thought. More like a liveliness of mind. Last term, his questions had always been serious, all about the strict mechanics of matter and transformation. That discussion about diamonds and graphite had stuck with her. It had even pushed her into a direction she'd never considered. On the first day back this term, he'd asked that bizarre question about Nadarians, and she still vividly remembered the look on Phileas's face when he told her about it. Now he'd produced this winged rabbit. Technically flawless, yes, but it carried something else. A hint of playfulness. Professor McGonagall couldn't decide if that was good or bad. But she was certain of one thing. Something had changed in Black over the holiday. Maybe an experience. Maybe a spell. Or maybe something. She only hoped it was for the better. Regulus had no idea she'd just gone through an entire train of thought about him. He was simply putting ideas into practice, letting rational analysis and intuitive creativity exist side by side. He used logic to break down a rabbit's physiology. He used imagination to come up with the amusing idea of a rabbit that could fly. Then he combined the two and made the transformation happen. The result was excellent. He planned to wait until he'd fully absorbed everything in Professor McGonagall's notes before asking a more advanced question, something that might earn him access to deeper transfiguration knowledge. The last discussion, turning graphite into diamond, had benefited him enormously. Next time, he should push further. For example, where the limits of living transfiguration really were. Where the boundary lay between transfiguration and creating life. Thinking like that deepened his understanding, and it steadily strengthened his ability. When the bell rang, students began packing up and leaving. Regulus turned the winged rabbit back into a handkerchief, folded it neatly, set it back on the desk, and headed toward the Slytherin common room with Cuthbert and the others. The corridors were busy. First years hurried along in mild panic, trying to find their next classroom. Older students clustered in small groups, talking in low voices. Portraits dozed in their frames or chatted with their neighbors. Suits of armor stood motionless in alcoves, as if they'd never moved in their lives. As Regulus reached the stair landing on the second floor, he felt something. A subtle shift in space. About 10 yards behind him, the air rippled, so faint most people would never notice. Regulus recognized it instantly. A house elf. Hogwarts had hundreds of them, working in the kitchens, cleaning dormitories, running errands all over the castle. They came and went freely, operating with their own peculiar style of space magic. That alone was nothing unusual. Except Regulus kept walking, and that ripple followed. It held at roughly the same distance. When he turned, it turned. When he climbed stairs, it climbed. When he stopped and pretended to tie his shoe, it stopped too. Regulus understood. He was being watched. But why? Possibilities flashed through his mind. Had something from Nocturne Alley been exposed over the holiday? The Cruciatus curse? Unlikely. People died in places like Nocturne Alley and no one cared, and his father would have cleaned it up thoroughly. The conversations at the Malfoy dinner? Those had all been careful, indirect. Nothing concrete enough to justify surveillance. What else had he done? Then another thought surfaced. This kind of attention might have started last term. He'd been too conspicuous at Hogwarts. The chief status. Crushing fifth years. Having high-level discussions with professors. Any of that could draw notice. And in Hogwarts, who was the most likely, and most justified, person to keep an eye on a gifted student? There was only one answer. Dumbledore. Regulus thought of Dumbledore's history with Voldemort. The way the headmaster had taken notice of Tom Riddle early, and how that attention had eventually turned into open conflict. A headmaster like that would absolutely observe a student who showed unusual talent. Not out of malice, necessarily. More out of caution, planning, and for preparation. Regulus didn't care. If anything, it might even be useful. Let him watch. Regulus had no intention of hiding much, at least not in public. In class, he was an excellent student, diligent, curious, thoughtful. In front of professors, he was polite and respectful, eager to learn. Around classmates, he kept his housemates in check, discouraged conflict, maintained order within Slytherin. Those were all things that could withstand observation. And it wasn't truly surveillance so much as observation. Dumbledore wanted to see what kind of person he was, what road he'd choose, what decisions he'd make. Fine. Let him see Regulus attending lessons properly. Studying magic. Maintaining basic relationships. Let him see how a normal student, talented enough to potentially affect the future of the magical world, grew up. All of that was acceptable. The dormitory was not. Regulus trusted Dumbledore wouldn't cross that line. The headmaster had limits. He wouldn't invade a student's most basic private space. Besides, there were too many things in the dormitory that could never be seen. Star-guided meditation practice. Digestion of inherited magic. Dangerous knowledge pulled from the restricted section. His own notes and thoughts. None of that could be exposed to Dumbledore. If his roommates noticed bits and pieces, it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't understand what they were looking at. Then Regulus thought of a place. The Room of Requirement. He'd known it existed for a while, but he'd never gone. Partly because he hadn't truly needed it, partly because he didn't want to touch secrets too early. But now, it felt like the right time. On Halloween night, the Bloody Baron had mentioned that Hogwarts hid a place only someone who truly understood the nature of magic could find. That place held clues left behind by Rowena Ravenclaw, clues about wisdom, about the soul, about the possibility of surpassing death itself. If it was tied to Ravenclaw, then the Room of Requirement was very likely one of the entrances. Still, Regulus wasn't in a hurry to chase those clues. His understanding of soul magic wasn't deep enough yet, and the idea of surpassing death was even further away. And the Room of Requirement held other things too. Voldemort's Horcrux. Ravenclaw's diadem. He didn't want to touch any of that yet. For now, he only needed one simple thing from the Room of Requirement. A practice space that was absolutely private, where no one could interrupt him. He didn't want to hide anything. He didn't want to search for anything. He just needed space. That would be enough. A normal room for practicing magic, nothing that would disturb a Horcrux. Regulus made his decision. Tonight, he'd go. When he reached the entrance to the Slytherin common room, the space ripple vanished. The house elf had probably finished this round of observation and gone back to report to Dumbledore. Regulus stepped inside. The fireplace crackled warmly. A few seventh years were talking in low voices in the corner. When they saw the first years come in, they gave a brief nod. Narcissa wasn't there. She was probably in class, or out doing prefect rounds. Regulus returned to the dormitory and set his books down. Hermes was already back, sitting on his bed with an old book in his hands. The cover had no title at all. He glanced up when Regulus entered, then dropped his gaze and kept reading. Regulus noticed the book gave off a faint, unusual magical presence. It felt like a curse. And the book itself, judging by the texture, might have been bound in human skin. He didn't ask. Everyone had secrets. As long as Hermes's secret didn't affect him, Regulus didn't care. He stayed in the dormitory for about half an hour. When he was sure the house elf hadn't returned, he got up and headed to the Great Hall for dinner. After that, he'd spend a little time in the library, and around curfew, he'd go see the Room of Requirement. Chapter 78, The Room of Requirement. After dinner, Regulus headed into the library. Madame Pants sat behind the desk at the entrance, polishing her glasses with a soft cloth. When she saw him, she only lifted her eyelids slightly and said nothing. The library still wasn't very crowded. A few 7th years were digging through references in a corner, 2 Ravenclaw girls leaned close together and whispered over notes, and a handful of Hufflepuffs were rushing to finish homework. Regulus went to the charms section and pulled out common spells and their variations. The book was old, the cover worn pale along the edges. The pages had yellowed with age, but everything inside was clean, orderly, and free of bent corners. He found a seat near a window, open to where he'd left off, and started reading the analysis of the knockback jinx. The spell itself was simple, he'd learned it ages ago, but other people's thinking could still be useful. The book described a combined use of the knockback jinx and a shielding charm that could send someone flying a great distance. Outside the window, the sky darkened. One by one, the castle's lamps came alive. Regulus turned a page, and his mind slid to something else. Last term, he'd slipped into the restricted section more than once, wrapped head to toe in an improved disillusionment charm that blocked light, heat, and most magical fluctuations. At the time, he'd thought it was flawless. He'd believed he could fool Madame Pants and move through the shelves like a ghost. Now, looking back, that confidence felt naive. If Dumbledore really had been watching him since last term, then there was a decent chance the headmaster already knew about those late-night visits. But then again, if it had been noticed and never stopped, that was permission by silence. A soft but sharp cough cut through the quiet, Madame Pants's warning. Regulus looked up and realized there were only a few students left. He closed the book, returned it to the shelf, and followed the last trickle of people out of the library. The corridor lighting was dim. Most portraits were asleep, while a few were still awake, yawning in their frames or fussing with collars and sleeves. Regulus didn't go straight back to Slytherin. He stopped at a second-floor corner, glanced around to make sure the hall was empty, then gave a small sweep of his wand in front of him. A cold sensation washed over his skin as the disillusionment charm took hold. His outline blurred, edges melting into the surroundings. This version was his own improvement. It didn't just hide him visually. It pushed his footsteps, breathing, scent, body heat, and magical signature down as low as he could manage. But now he suspected even that wasn't enough. Disillusionment worked by using magic to twist light and produce a visual trick. The spell itself created a magical fluctuation, and a skilled wizard could sense that fluctuation. The Potter family's invisibility cloak was a legendary artifact, said to be a gift from death itself, one of the Deathly Hallows. Even that level of magic couldn't escape Dumbledore's notice. In the original history, Harry Potter had wandered the castle under the cloak, and Dumbledore still called his name with perfect accuracy. Even Snape might have noticed too, though that would be the older Snape, not the boy he was now. Regulus walked through the empty corridor without a sound. He needed something more complete than bending light. He needed light to pass through him as if he wasn't there at all. Silencing sound wasn't enough either. He wanted sound not to exist, wanted his body temperature to match the environment so perfectly there was nothing to detect. That might require altering the very state of being. He couldn't do it yet. His knowledge wasn't deep enough, and his control wasn't refined enough. When he reached the 8th floor, Regulus stopped. This was the stretch opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy being beaten senseless by trolls. In the dim lighting, the bare stone wall across from it looked especially plain. He focused, and repeated the thought in his mind. I need a place to practice magic. Absolutely private. No one can interrupt me. 3 times. The wall stayed empty. Nothing happened. He'd wanted to test different methods, even wondered if pacing back and forth 3 times was just a ritual, and the real key was whether the room could sense a strong enough need. But now it seemed clear. You still had to walk. Regulus paced back and forth in front of the tapestry 3 times. On the next heartbeat, a door appeared in the stone. It was oak, fine grain running across the surface, with a bright bronze handle. It simply existed. No sound, no flash of light, no ripple in space. It looked as if it had always been there, and he'd only just learned how to see it. Regulus opened every sense he had. He let his magic spread outward, searching for even the faintest anomaly in the air. There was nothing. The door's appearance hadn't stirred anything at all. The magic in the environment was steady. The space around it was seamless, unbroken. Even the flow of air seemed to slide around the door as if it had always belonged there. Regulus stood still, staring at it, caught in thought. The room of requirement responded to a wizard's need. But how? If it was transfiguration, Turning part of the wall into a door with a room behind it, there should be magical fluctuations. If it was space magic, opening an entrance in the wall, the structure of space should shift. If it was an illusion, his senses wouldn't come up completely blank. But he had nothing. No feedback at all. A thought bubbled up, uninvited. It had no proof, no logic, just something that surfaced from somewhere deep. Maybe the room of requirement was always here, suspended in a state between existence and non-existence. When a wizard's need became clear enough, when that need was observed by whatever mechanism governed the room, the state collapsed into a definite reality. The idea made his breath catch slightly. If that was true, if Rowena Ravenclaw had designed this room using concepts that touched the deepest rules of the world itself, then her magic was far beyond anything recorded in later generations, reaching something almost mythical. Regulus pushed the shock down. He couldn't verify any of it. He didn't even understand the room's basic mechanism, let alone its deeper design. Some things in the magical world were simply like that. They existed. They worked. You used them. You had no idea why they were possible. He didn't understand it, but it left him shaken in the best way. If he couldn't understand it, then he wouldn't force it tonight. Regulus gripped the bronze handle and pushed the door open. Inside was a training hall. The room was enormous, easily more than 20 meters across in both directions, with the ceiling about 10 meters high, tall enough for most spell practice. The floor was covered in dark wooden boards with a slight spring to them, meant to soften the impact of a fall. The walls were smooth stone, carved with runes that absorbed magic, preventing spells from rebounding or damaging the structure. In one corner, several training dummies stood, wrapped in thick leather. In another, a wooden table held a few books and practice tools. Clearly, this place saw regular use. Regulus swept his eyes around. He didn't find any fresh sign of another person, but there were scorch marks on the dummies, scuffed wear on the floorboards, and a faint polish along the table's edge from years of hands and sleeves brushing past. The room of requirement was secret, but not unknown. In the original history, Harry Potter used it for meetings. Draco Malfoy used it to repair the vanishing cabinet. Dumbledore used it as a toilet. Plenty of students stumbled into it by accident. Over centuries, this room had been found countless times. He couldn't treat it like a private sanctuary that belonged only to him. Regulus walked to the center of the room and sat cross-legged. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Confirm the location, learn the feel of the place. But he was already here, and it would be a waste not to practice a little. There were things he needed to test, things he couldn't comfortably do in the common room or dormitory. This place was perfect. He reached into his pocket and drew out a single gold galleon. It glinted a dull gold in his palm, the ridged edge sharp and clean. On one side was the face of a Gringotts goblin. On the other, a stamped numerical code. He set the coin on the floor in front of him, then stepped back 3 paces. Spatial fold. He'd been practicing this magic constantly, ever since Christmas, since the first time he'd managed to move a brooch 5 centimeters. Every day, he carved out time to try again. Progress was painfully slow. Slow enough that most people would have called it no progress at all. Regulus didn't mind. Magic had never been a matter of one night's effort. He closed his eyes and let his perception spread. The space around the galleon was stable, dense with tiny anchor points. Within 3 meters, the structure of space formed a 3-dimensional map in his mind, every node, every connection, the strength of each line. The theory was simple. Let space fold on itself. Bring 2 nodes together. Pass the object through. Regulus focused. Magic rose from within him and pressed directly against space itself. He locked onto the node where the galleon sat, and imagined it like a buoy on water, sliding down an invisible slope toward a nearby empty point. His magic touched the structure. The node trembled slightly, and the air around the coin produced a ripple too fine for the eye to see. Regulus adjusted his output, followed the natural tendency of the structure, and found the easiest point to slip in. His will narrowed onto the galleon. Magic stretched along the grain of space itself, driven purely by intent and power together. The coin vanished. There was no transition. One moment it was there, the next it was on the floor 2 meters away. The placement was off. Not the target point he'd chosen. The error was nearly half a meter. The goblin's face gleamed upward under the training hall's light. Regulus walked over and picked it up. The metal felt faintly warm. Residual friction from the fold. which meant he had a long way to go. Chapter 79, Oh no, did I blow my cover? The magic cost of a spatial fold was roughly the same as a disarming charm. That part, he could handle. What he couldn't ignore was the faint weariness creeping through his mind. It was the after effect of inherited magic he still hadn't fully digested. The strain on his thoughts ran heavier than it usually did. He'd improved, yes. Not nearly enough. He was still nowhere close to using it in real combat. If he wanted a spell to travel through space, he'd need precise control over the fold's path and its landing point. The smaller the error, the better, and doing that with a moving spell would be harder than sending an object. If he wanted Protego to take effect at range, the fold would have to be instantaneous. Ideally, it would have no delay at all. Because if a fight ever forced him to rely on a trick like this, losing even a fraction of a second could get him killed. And if he wanted to directly strike a target's internal organs, he'd have to pierce layers of defense, magical barriers, physical tissue, even protections aimed at the soul. Every part of that required endless practice. Deeper understanding of space. Finer control of magic. A mind tough enough to take the pressure. Regulus had patience. The road was visible. All he had to do was keep walking it. He slipped the galleon back into his pocket and rose to his feet. Time to go. Regulus stepped out of the room of requirement. The door closed behind him without a sound, and the wall smoothed back into plain stone, as if nothing had ever been there. He wrapped himself in the disillusionment charm again and headed back the way he'd come, toward the Slytherin dorms. He didn't pass a single person. The portraits were asleep. The castle felt so quiet it was like it had sunk to the bottom of the sea. By the time he made it to the dormitory, it was nearly 1 in the morning. Cuthbert and Alex were already out, steady breathing drifting from behind their bed curtains. Hermes's bed was empty. The curtains were drawn tight, but there was no one inside. Regulus washed up, climbed into bed, and closed his eyes. His star-guided meditation began to run on its own. 4 silver stars turned slowly in the depths of his awareness, and magic circulation eased the surface edge of his fatigue. But the deeper burden, the one caused by too much inherited knowledge flooding in too fast, would take real rest to lessen. He decided he'd cut back on intense training for the next few days and focus on digesting what he'd gained in verdant magic and the space anchor charm. January at Hogwarts was bone-deep cold. Snow drifted down beneath a sullen sky. Outside the castle, thick snow had piled along the edge of the forbidden forest. The Black Lake wore a thin skin of ice, its surface reflecting a dull, grey-white sheen under the heavy clouds. Inside wasn't much better. The stone corridor walls felt icy to the touch, and condensation fogged the windows. Even with magic maintaining the temperature, students still huddled tighter in their robes. Herbology was in Greenhouse 3. Regulus stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. It was far warmer than outside. Magic held the air at the right temperature, damp and rich with the scent of soil and living plants. The greenhouse was packed with magical flora. From common devil's snare to rarities like venomous tentacula, each species grew in its own section. Professor Sprout stood in the center wearing her dirt-stained apron, a small trowel in hand. "Today we're loosening the soil and repotting mandrake seedlings," she said, her voice gentle and clear as it carried through the room. "In pairs. Each pair takes 1 seedling. Remember the steps. Earmuffs and dragonhide gloves on first, then you begin." Students lined up for earmuffs and tools. Cuthbert immediately paired with Regulus, and together they collected a pot holding a mandrake seedling. It sat in a black clay pot, no bigger than Regulus's palm. Its leaves were a fresh, tender green, and a tiny purple flower bloomed at the top. It looked harmless. It wasn't. A full-grown mandrake's cry was lethal, striking at body and mind alike. In the original history, Neville Longbottom had been so nervous in herbology that he forgot his earmuffs. When he heard a young mandrake's cry, he'd briefly fainted. A mature mandrake, screaming at full strength, could kill on the spot. But a seedling wasn't the same. Its magic hadn't fully developed yet. The fatal force hadn't finished forming. Regulus put on his earmuffs. The world dropped into sudden quiet until he could only hear his own breathing and the steady beat of his heart. He looked down at the seedling and let his senses spread, brushing lightly over leaf, stem, and soil. Inside it, he could see the movement of magic, like delicate silver streams slowly circulating through plant tissue. The flow carried a distinct quality, something he could read much more clearly now that he'd begun to grasp verdant magic. It wasn't so much emotion as it was a property. A tendency. Some plants carried gentle magic, suited for healing, like Dittany. Some plants carried violent magic, suited for attack, like venomous tentacula. Mandrake was different. Carefully, Regulus guided a thread of verdant magic forward, linking it with the seedling's magic for just a moment. A response rippled back. Natural chaos, unshaped and raw, like a forming hiss that never quite became a sound. It was a vibration at the level of magic itself, and it left his soul faintly unsettled just to feel it. Magnify that 1,000 times, add a voice as the carrier and amplifier, and you'd get a scream that killed. But right now, it was small. Regulus cut the connection after 3 seconds. Even then, even with it being only a seedling and only 3 seconds, nausea rolled through him, the kind that hit after a long ride in a jolting carriage. A faint dizziness stirred deep in his skull. It faded quickly, but it was enough to prove the danger. And he couldn't openly study it. This mandrake seedling belonged to Hogwarts and it was very valuable and rare. Every plant here was recorded. One missing would be a disaster. Professor Sprout wouldn't let him siphon magic from it, not even in a cautious, barely their way. Still, the Black family's herb garden in Cornwall had mandrakes too. Even if the family estate kept strict counts and records, it was his family's property. And he was the heir. Using a little of his own wouldn't be a crime. Regulus steadied himself and began loosening the soil. He moved with care, using the small trowel to lift and part the top layer, exposing a fine web of roots beneath. Mandrake roots were a pale yellow, like tiny ginseng, branching again and again. Faint pinpricks of magical light dotted the surface. Cuthbert helped beside him, passing tools and holding the pot steady. They worked well enough together. Cuthbert's aim wasn't perfect, and he came dangerously close to nicking a root more than once, but at least he didn't actually do it. Other pairs weren't as lucky. One Hufflepuff boy shoveled too hard, snapped off part of a root, and lost 5 points on the spot. The lesson flew by. When the bell rang, most students had finished repotting, settling the seedlings into larger clay pots, packing in fresh soil, and watering them with a special nutrient solution. In the new earth, the mandrakes looked livelier. Leaves swayed faintly, and the tiny purple flower opened a little wider. Regulus was just starting to stand when Professor Sprout called, "Mr. Black, stay a moment." The rest of the class filed out. Cuthbert glanced back at Regulus, eyes asking if he should wait. Regulus shook his head. Cuthbert left with the others. Soon only Regulus and Professor Sprout remained in the greenhouse. She removed her gloves, wiped her hands on her apron, and came to stand in front of him. She wasn't tall, and she was a bit round, but she held herself straight. Sun and wind had left their mark on her face, and her eyes were a warm brown. "We spoke last term," she said gently, "about magical plants, about what you called their emotions and their magic." Regulus nodded. "Yes, Professor. I remember what you asked," she continued. "Whether a bubotuber feels pain when it secretes pus." He nodded again. "I told you then that many magical plants do seem to have simple emotions." Professor Sprout's tone stayed mild, but her gaze sharpened with intent. "But I want to add something now. Emotion isn't quite the right word. Not for magical plants." She stepped to a patch of dittany and lightly touched a leaf with her fingertips. "They grow. They respond. They have magic. They have sensation. But the words we use, pain, joy, anger, those are wizard standards we lay over them." Regulus listened in silence, thoughts turning. Why was she telling him this now? Had she noticed something? "But the nature of a plant's magic," Professor Sprout said, turning back to him, "that is accurate. Some kinds of magic are gentle and beneficial to witches and wizards. We call that good. Some are violent and harmful. We call that bad. But magic itself isn't good or bad. It simply has different qualities." She looked directly at Regulus. "I also told you before that a mandrake's cry carries a powerful kind of mental impact magic. It interferes with the listener's soul stability, causes consciousness to collapse, and kills on the level of the mind. At the same time, that collapse triggers a chain reaction in the body, so what finally kills is the double failure of body and mind." Regulus nodded seriously. He remembered her explanation clearly. Then Professor Sprout shifted, as if stepping onto the true point. "But the deeper reason is that its magic contains a tendency toward decomposition," she said. "That tendency rides on sound, and when it reaches a living thing, it pushes at both flesh and soul until the structure begins to break down. Something tightened in Regulus's chest. A tendency. He'd only just begun to sense that distinction himself, and she'd named it outright, without hesitation. So she really had noticed something. Chapter 80, Professor Sprout is a good professor bonus. Regulus stayed where he was, fingers absently rubbing together as he sank into thought. Professor Sprout's words echoed in his head. Emotion wasn't precise. What was precise was nature, and magic carried its own tendencies. And then something clicked. After getting verdant magic over the holidays, he'd used Dittany's magic to heal wounds and watched the plant wither afterward. Even then, he'd vaguely sensed that magic had a kind of leaning to it. Some of it was gentle as spring water. Some of it burned like fire. But that still wasn't the same thing Professor Sprout was talking about. What he'd understood back then was closer to what she'd call a magic's nature. He'd thought it was some hidden knowledge that came with the Black family inheritance. A secret only a few people ever touched. Now he understood. Professor Sprout had taught herbology here for 20 years. She'd cared for hundreds of magical plants with her own hands. She'd seen how venomous tentacula could leave an animal paralyzed from head to toe. She'd seen devil's snare stretch its vines at night and drink the life out of anything trapped inside it. She'd watched mandrakes go from seedlings to full-grown plants, start to finish. If anything, she knew more than he did. Far more. He'd gotten knowledge from an inheritance and tested it until he found answers. She'd spent decades living those answers, building rules from experience. The tiny spark of superiority that had started to rise in him vanished in an instant. A seedling's magic isn't complete, Professor Sprout went on. So the cry can only make people feel unwell, it can't kill. But the magic is already there, it's just not strong enough yet. She looked at him, and Regulus lifted his head to meet her eyes. Warm brown. Fine lines at the corners. And right now, a quiet meaning sat behind her gaze. Regulus understood. She'd seen straight through him. She knew he'd used verdant magic to touch the seedling. She knew he was studying the nature of magic, and she might even have guessed he'd gained something unusual. And honestly, good. Verdant magic wasn't the sort of thing he needed to hide away like a crime. If she'd already seen it, then he could ask questions openly. He could practice openly. And she still hadn't exposed him. She was simply teaching, giving him the truth in the plainest way possible. Sound was only the carrier. The real danger was decomposition itself, the nature embedded in the magic. A seedling's magic wasn't complete, so it could only make you sick. A full mandrake was complete, so it could kill. Professor Sprout's expression softened again, back to her usual warmth. Studying the nature of magical plants' magic is a valuable direction, but it's also dangerous. Some natures, once triggered, can't be undone. Mandrakes are only one example. There are others like venomous tentacula's nerve paralysis, devil's snare's life-draining and the whomping willow's physical pulverizing. She was warning him, and guiding him. Don't get distracted by surface effects. Understand what lies underneath. Don't touch dangerous plants casually. Build knowledge and protection first. But it was the words themselves that struck him hardest. With each one, something in his mind cracked open a little wider. He felt inspired, and at the same time, a faint tightness crawled up his spine. Paralysis, draining, pulverizing and decomposition. They weren't spell names. They weren't textbook terms, at least not in the way Hogwarts usually taught them. They described outcomes. Final states. The way magic expressed itself once it took hold. Which meant the magic itself carried the quality that produced that state. In this context, those words sounded less like explanations and more like concepts. They sat beneath any single spell. More fundamental, more direct, and more abstract. This was real guidance. Regulus had ideas, but they'd been hazy and uncertain. Little bubbles of inspiration that popped before he could grab them. He might have discovered this on his own one day, or he might not. He might have wandered through 100 wrong turns, or missed the crucial clue entirely. And now Professor Sprout had pointed straight at it, saving him time, giving him a direction to walk toward. Maybe it was close. Maybe it was far. He didn't know. He only knew he would keep going. Sometimes true teaching was only one sentence. Thank you, Professor, Regulus said, bowing deeply, the gratitude in his voice real. Professor Sprout smiled, the lines on her face easing. You're talented, and you think for yourself. Stay curious, but stay cautious. The wizarding world is vast, and some things need time before you can truly understand them. Regulus nodded seriously and thanked her again. It reminded him of what Professor Flitwick had said after charms once. Magic was there. Everyone understood it differently. But you had to believe in the strength of your mind. Different words, same core. Don't rush, take your time and always keep your mind open. When he left the greenhouse and started back toward the castle, he was still sorting through the conversation in his head. And another thought surfaced. How powerful was Professor Sprout, really? Those natures and tendencies she'd named so easily, could she use them herself, shaping them into magic? Or were they simply rules she'd observed and summarized? He didn't know. But one thing felt certain. Professor Sprout shouldn't be dismissed as a gardener who happened to teach. Her understanding of magic ran deep, and it had structure. She had to be a powerful witch. Professor Flitwick had pointed him toward magic's irrational side. Professor McGonagall had guided him deeper into Transfiguration's essence. Professor Sprout had shown him a direction for verdant magic. Every professor at Hogwarts guided their students in their own way. They really were good people. He could feel their kindness, plain as sunlight, even if none of them would ever call it that. A flicker of emotion rose in his chest, then he pressed it down. Feelings were feelings. What he needed was to turn that feeling into action, and turn that insight into strength. Slughorn, old. Dear Professor, you're the only one left. Time to start coughing up those galleons. Friday's defense against the dark arts classroom was on the 3rd floor. The windows faced the courtyard, and beyond it he could see snow piled along the edge of the forbidden forest. When Regulus walked in, most of the class was already seated. Cuthbert and Alex had saved him a spot in the middle rows by the window. Hermes sat alone in the back corner, head down over his textbook. Professor Galatea Merrythought stood at the front. A middle-aged witch, hair neatly combed, deep grey robes, and an expression that always seemed a bit too dramatic for whatever she was saying. Today we're covering 2 things, Professor Merrythought announced, opening the book. First, the red sparks. The incantation is Vermilius. It's used to send up a red signal light. If you're lost or in danger outdoors, it lets you warn your companions. She wrote the incantation and pronunciation on the blackboard. Rotate your wrist like this, wand tip up. When you cast, picture red or green light spraying from the tip, then maintain the spell. She demonstrated. A fist-sized red orb of light bloomed at her wand tip and floated in the air, casting a soft red glow. It held for 3 seconds, then winked out without leaving a trace. A safety charm. It won't cause harm, Professor Merrythought said. Now pair up and practice. Students started practicing. Cuthbert paired with Regulus again, as usual. Regulus succeeded on the first try. The orb was clean and standard, the color pure, the duration precise. But his focus wasn't really on the exercise, because another thought had already started chewing at him. Light magic. Light was wave and particle at the same time, a form that carried both properties. Red was because the magic's frequency. Regulus stopped himself. No. He decided to try a different approach. Don't think like that. Don't think about duality, don't think about frequency. Think about magic. If it wasn't only light, what if light could carry information? Light already carried information. And sometimes information could be a weapon. Or what if light could become physical, packed with energy, and then explode? He could give it symbolism. Give it meaning. Light as warmth. Light as protection. Light pushing back the dark. And then his mind drifted even further. Light as the light of civilization. While those thoughts scattered through him, his hand kept practicing on autopilot. The orb flared again and again, appearing, hovering, fading. Half an hour later, Professor Merrythought clapped her hands to stop them. Second topic. Gnomes. She flipped to another page. Gnomes are magical creatures. Average height, 30 inches. Pointed ears. They like stealing and eating magical plants. They're common in gardens and courtyards, and they're pests. The book included a simple sketch and an anatomy diagram, made for young witches and wizards to understand. To deal with gnomes, you use the gripping charm. Cast it, grab the gnome, spin, and throw it past the boundary. She repeated the incantation and showed the movement, but didn't demonstrate. Next class we'll do a practical, clearing gnomes from the Hogwarts grounds. Today is theory. A low cheer went up across the room. Practical lessons were always more fun than theory, especially in defense against the dark arts, a subject that should have been exciting and somehow managed to be dull. A few Gryffindors were already whispering about how to throw a gnome the farthest. The Slytherins were more restrained, but even they wore looks of anticipation. Regulus wasn't particularly interested. A gnome was low grade. It had about as much combat value as nothing at all. The only annoyance was their numbers, how fast they ran, and how good they were at burrowing. Compared to everything else on his plate, it barely registered. And the new ideas he'd just had would have to wait. Chapter 81, Small Class Lesson Bonus. After that, the castle fell completely silent. Wrapped in a disillusionment charm, Regulus slipped out of the Slytherin common room. The corridors were empty. Portraits dozed in their frames, suits of armor stood motionless, and only the torches along the walls still burned, casting wavering shadows across the stone. He deliberately expanded his senses. His magic spread outward, brushing through the air, catching even the faintest disturbance. At the same time, his spatial awareness unfolded. Within its range, the castle's structure formed clearly in his mind, every seam in the walls, every turn in the corridor, even the subtle eddies of moving air. No house elves and no signs of surveillance. He wasn't surprised. Dumbledore's observation was likely intermittent, not constant. Perhaps nothing had been arranged tonight, or perhaps the elves were busy elsewhere. Either way, it didn't matter. He reached the library. Madame Pance's desk sat empty. Moving with practiced ease, he made his way to the restricted section and stopped before the shelf devoted to soul magic. Soul resilience, on resisting the imperious and mental enchantment. As usual, he began to read. The book described defenses against the imperious curse. At its core, the curse worked by forcing the caster's will over the targets, blending thoughts until the victim could no longer tell which ideas were their own. The standard defense was strengthening one's will and erecting mental safeguards. Conventional thinking. But Regulus was thinking further. Over Christmas break, Orion had tested his mental strength with the imperious curse. He had resisted. His victory came from the unyielding will forged through star-guided meditation and the labyrinth of thought constructed through occlumency. Yet afterward, an idea had lingered. The imperious overlaid the will. What if it went a step further? Not overlay. Not suppression. But replacement. If a person's will was a castle, the imperious sent an army to storm it, slaughter the defenders, and plant its own flag. It was a violent conquest from the start, and resistance was inevitable. Failure was always a possibility. But what if the method changed? Instead of sending soldiers, send architects, craftsmen, officials, or even spies. Slowly infiltrate, alter the structure, replace key figures. Quietly reshape the castle until it no longer belonged to its original master. By the time the target noticed, it would be too late. That would no longer be the imperious curse. It would be something higher. A more refined form of mental control. It would demand immense mental strength and precision. A deep understanding of the structure of will itself. But in theory, it was possible. Especially against someone weak-willed or mentally flawed. Regulus withdrew his magic and closed his eyes. An intriguing thought. For now, nothing more than speculation. His mental strength wasn't sufficient yet, and his understanding of will structures was nearly non-existent, let alone the fine control required. Still, it was a direction. When star-guided meditation advanced further, when the fifth star was lit or more, his mental strength would rise to an entirely new level. Then he could experiment. Like start with small animals. Regulus continued browsing the other restricted texts. Every visit left him with the same impression. Hogwarts was a vault of treasures. It was already 2 in the morning when he returned to the dormitory. Cuthbert and Alex were asleep, their breathing steady behind their bed curtains. Hermes's bed remained empty, curtains drawn tight, no one inside. After washing up, Regulus lay down. Hermes was absent from the dormitory more often than he was, and Regulus frequently wandered the castle at night. Last term, even when Hermes roamed, he at least returned to sleep. This term, entire nights passed without him. He no longer followed the small circle either. Cuthbert had already voiced his displeasure, calling withdrawal from the group a betrayal. Alex had no complaints. If anything, he seemed faintly pleased. A gloomy boy like Hermes didn't attract affection. Slytherin always had its little factions. Some bound by blood, others by shared interests. Among the older students, many gathered around Voldemort's ideals. Once they graduated, they would don black robes, wear silver masks, and dedicate their strength to the grand cause. Regulus wasn't concerned with that. He was thinking about Hermes. Was his task entering a critical phase? Images from last term surfaced in his mind, cursed books, empty glass bottles, maps marked with hidden areas of the castle, and the occasional scorch marks on Hermes's skin, the faint scent of sulfur clinging to him. He was searching for something. Or carrying out a family mission. As long as it didn't interfere with him, Regulus had no intention of intervening. Everyone had secrets. As long as Hermes's didn't become a threat, he would let him be. Still, he needed to keep watch. Hermes had value. He was worth pulling up at a critical moment. Last term, he had demonstrated strength. Now, it was clear that it wasn't enough. Regulus closed his eyes and let his consciousness sink into star-guided meditation. 4 silver stars flared in the darkness, outlining Orion's shape. Magic flowed along their paths in a steady cycle, easing the day's fatigue. The pressure on his mind gradually lightened. Late January, Friday afternoon. The Charms classroom was half empty. Professor Flitwick had formally invited Regulus to attend an advanced Charms seminar. In reality, it was just him and a handful of upper-year students. Regulus knew this was a Hogwarts tradition. Professors would invite truly talented young witches and wizards for individual instruction. He had accepted readily, though privately he thought, Flitwick is in place. How long before Professor McGonagall? He already had questions prepared for her. Professor Flitwick stood atop his stack of books. Only 5 students faced him. 3 7th years, 2 from Ravenclaw and 1 from Hufflepuff, and a 6th-year Gryffindor. They sat in the front row, quills poised over parchment. Regulus took a seat by the window in the second row. The chair beside him remained empty. The older students glanced at him repeatedly, their gazes friendly and curious. No one treated him differently for being only a first year. In truth, his reputation preceded him. Today's topic isn't in the syllabus, Professor Flitwick began. His voice was softer than in regular class, lower, his eyes bright. Emotional resonance in spell casting. Or rather, how a caster's state of mind affects magical results. With the same Wingardium Leviosa, he raised his wand, first like this. A tap of his wand, and the quill on the lectern rose smoothly into the air. It wobbled gently, like a dandelion seed floating in a light breeze. The ascent was slow and soft. At the peak, there was even a faint pause. When I cast it, I was thinking of lightness and joy. Like seeing a butterfly for the first time in spring. Flitwick smiled faintly. Now. He flicked his wand. The quill dropped back onto the desk. A moment later, he cast again. This time the quill shot upward, twice as fast as before, nib pointing downward. It stopped exactly 30 centimeters above the table. There was no wobble at all. The ink sac cast a long, thin shadow in the sunlight. This time, I was thinking of responsibility, Flitwick said, studying the quill. It must rise. It must be stable. It must be precise. Regulus stared at the quill. He could feel the difference. The magical intensity hadn't changed, but its texture had. The first spell's flow was gentle and steady. The second was taut and focused. Both had accomplished levitation. But the manner was different. The incantation is fixed, Flitwick continued. The movement, the pronunciation, the magic. They're all written in your textbooks. But witches and wizards aren't magical tools. We have emotions. We have states of mind. Thoughts in the moment. Those extra elements seep into magic and influence the spell. A 7th-year Ravenclaw raised her hand. Professor, is there a standard for that influence? I mean, can it be quantified? Very difficult, Flitwick shook his head. Everyone's emotions differ. Even the same person's emotions vary from moment to moment. But what we can confirm is that mental state affects the spell's texture. Regulus's gaze remained on the quill as a thought formed. He raised his hand. Mr. Black. Professor, Regulus asked politely, the incantation and wand movement are fixed, but a wizard's inner state alters the spell's effect. Is that alteration governed by patterns? Can it be deliberately controlled and reproduced? Flitwick regarded him seriously. You're suggesting consciously manipulating one's mental state to adjust spell outcomes. Yes, Professor. Regulus nodded. With the same Wingardium Leviosa, casting under different emotional conditions produces perceptible differences in magical trajectory and final result. Do those differences stem from the wizard's inner state influencing the magic itself? He paused, searching for the right word. Infusing it? If so, what is the mechanism behind that infusion? Through systematic training, can a specific inner state become a stable casting condition that can be reliably invoked? The classroom fell silent. Professor Flitwick drew in a deep breath. You've touched upon a subject of advanced spellcraft, he said gravely. The spell determines what can be done. The wizard's mind determines how it is done. When he was young, Professor Dumbledore researched this field extensively. He called it the resonance between mental imagery and magic. Chapter 82, The Imagery of the Starry Sky. Professor Flitwick continued, your observation is correct. The patroness charm is the most direct example. It requires the caster to draw upon a deeply positive force within themselves. The quality of that force directly determines the patroness's form and strength. If there isn't enough corresponding light in your heart, the spell simply won't ignite. Regulus listened quietly. The patroness was familiar territory for him. In theory, any spell can be infused by the caster's inner state, Flitwick went on, deliberately borrowing Regulus's word. However, that infusion is usually unconscious and fluid, and very difficult to pin down. Attempting to control it deliberately can be dangerous. Forcing your emotional state to conform to a spell may cause unexpected changes in the result. It might turn out well. It might not. If it turns out badly enough, it can even cause damage on the level of the soul. But it isn't impossible, Regulus said. Flitwick studied him for a long moment. No, the professor admitted at last with a slow nod. It isn't impossible. The path is simply littered with pitfalls. Many witches and wizards have tried throughout history. Some succeeded. Some went mad. More became stuck halfway and could never again find the effortless purity they once had in casting. Regulus inclined his head thoughtfully. He understood that logic well. The killing curse demanded absolute murderous intent. The Cruciatus curse required a genuine desire to inflict suffering. The Imperious curse thrived on a powerful urge to dominate. The stronger the emotion, the greater the spell's potency. That was one of the fundamental principles of dark magic. Many dark spells. Flitwick lowered his voice, his expression growing grave. In advanced circles, dark magic was not a forbidden topic. Very few young witches and wizards were entirely isolated from it. Require intense negative emotions like anger, hatred, fear, pain. Those emotions reinforce dark magic, and dark magic, in turn, amplifies those emotions. The stronger the negativity, the stronger the spell. The stronger the spell, the deeper the negativity feeds. His gaze swept across the classroom, steady and warning. For those who pursue power through dark magic, this becomes a dangerous cycle. Flitwick paused and gave a faint shake of his head. Once they discover a path to greater strength, they will look for ways to deepen their negative emotions, deliberately courting pain, magnifying hatred, immersing themselves in darkness until eventually there is not a trace of positive feeling left. They grow more extreme. More detached from what most would call normal. At advanced levels, dark magic begins to erode the wizard in return. It is not that they cannot turn back. It is that they no longer recognize that they should. Regulus knew the professor meant it as a warning about the dangers of dark magic. Corruption. Descent into darkness. The loss of self. But his mind had already moved elsewhere. If one replaced the term dark magic with light magic, would the result truly be so different? Were those consumed by extreme positivity any less dangerous? What of a person who believed themselves absolutely right, whose sense of justice stood above all else, who viewed every opponent as evil by definition? Was that so different from extreme negativity? In both cases, the individual would sacrifice everything, including reason and empathy, for a chosen goal. Wizards rarely feared being surrounded by the excessively righteous, because positive emotions were often associated with kindness, justice, and protection. Yet extremity was still extremity. Society merely gilded one and condemned the other. Regulus recalled a line from a brief history of soul magic. A handful of powerful, resolute dark wizards had used dark magic frequently without suffering its influence. He suspected the explanation was simpler than most scholars imagined. It was not that they resisted corruption. It was that they did not treat dark magic as something inherently corrupting in the first place. Magic was magic. A tool. Any erosion came from instability within the caster's own heart. If someone's mind was strong enough, if they knew exactly what they were doing, why they were doing it, and were willing to bear the consequences, did the classification of the spell truly matter? Dumbledore had studied dark magic extensively in his youth and likely still did. Grindelwald had been a master of it. At their level, distinctions between dark and light felt almost superficial. What shaped them was not the spell itself, but the purpose behind it, and the beliefs that guided that purpose. As for Voldemort, better not to dwell on that. Regulus pulled his thoughts back. He was far from that level. It was premature to think in those terms. Still, he remained convinced that magic was a tool. Good and evil lay not in the spell, but in the choices of the one wielding it, and in the consequences that followed. After class, Professor Flitwick asked him to stay behind. "Your thinking is fascinating," Flitwick said, eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. "Continue to question and explore, but remember that theory and practice are not the same. The state of the mind is delicate. Forcing control may produce the opposite of what you intend." "I understand, Professor," Regulus replied with a respectful nod. The lesson had not introduced much that was new to him. Most of what Flitwick had explained, he already knew. Still, he appreciated the warning. It came from genuine concern. And it had served as a reminder. Leaving the classroom, he headed straight for the room of requirement. The training chamber was empty. The wooden floor gleamed softly beneath enchanted lamps. Regulus walked to the center of the room and sat cross-legged. He began to consider the imagery of the starry sky. What words truly captured it? Calm, vastness, grandeur, eternity. If he could inject that imagery as a stable backdrop into a spell. He raised his wand toward a training dummy. Protego. A silver-white shield unfolded before the dummy, a standard shield charm. Even thickness. Balanced magical distribution. Regulus drew a slow breath and closed his eyes. Star-guided meditation turned within him. The 4 stars of Orion flared in the depths of his consciousness, but he did not focus on their precise configuration. He focused on the sensation. Cold, distant starlight crossing unimaginable stretches of space to reach the Earth. The steady burn of stars across incomprehensible spans of time. The immensity of the universe. The eternity of the sky. The orderly motion of all things under immutable laws. He let that awareness fill him. Not an emotion but an image. An understanding. The universe was vast. Time was endless. He was insignificant within it, and yet that insignificant self could still think, still exist. Then he cast again. Protego. The shield bloomed once more. This time, it was different. The color turned silver-gray, with faint, star-like sparkles flickering across its surface. The texture felt denser and more solid. Like stone compressed over billions of years by tectonic force, tight and unyielding. The magical cost had increased by about 15%. He dispelled it and stepped forward, brushing his fingers through the space where the shield had stood. Residual magic lingered in the air. It worked. The cost was higher. He had to enter a deeper meditative state to summon the imagery. But it worked. This was something beyond emotional resonance. It was cognitive resonance. A rational understanding of the universe and the starry sky used as the tonal foundation for spell casting. Regulus committed the result to memory. It was only a beginning, but the direction was clear, and it was viable. In the future, he could experiment further. Infuse an offensive spell with the imagery of falling stars. A binding spell with the concept of gravitational pull. Even a healing spell with the notion of life emerging within the cosmos. There was much to test. Magic truly was extraordinary. No. Magic had always been extraordinary. In the final week of January, students still ran through corridors. Cutlery still clattered in the Great Hall. Professors still lectured in classrooms. Yet something discordant had vanished, at least from Regulus's perspective. Last term's unprovoked provocations, deliberate harassment, and probing confrontations had not occurred once this month. Within Slytherin, the atmosphere was unusually calm. Older students nodded politely when they saw him. Younger ones stepped aside of their own accord. Even the most troublesome pureblood heirs seemed to have discovered manners overnight. At least when facing him. Regulus knew why. His public appearance at the Malfoy family's Christmas banquet had signaled a certain stance. Many pureblood families would have instructed their children not to provoke him, at least for now. But he also knew the peace would not last. Among pure-blood upbringing, one principle was deeply ingrained: status must be contested, relationships navigated through rivalry. Peace was only a temporary ceasefire. Conflict was the norm. Some might even believe that under Voldemort's banner, harmony was undesirable. The Dark Lord might prefer his followers to compete and restrain one another. It made control easier. Sooner or later, someone would step forward. More likely to make a statement. To prove that their family did not fear the House of Black. That they dared to challenge. Or perhaps someone more foolish would think that if the Dark Lord desired internal tension, then manufacturing conflict would count as loyalty. Regulus waited. He was in no hurry. What was meant to come would come. Chapter 83, Ideological Infiltration. Wednesday afternoon found Regulus Black seated in the Slytherin common room with a book open on his lap. The fire in the hearth burned bright, its light glinting coldly off the silver and green decor. In one corner, a few second years played wizard's chess, the sharp crack of pieces striking one another echoing through the room. On the sofas, several seventh years were speaking in low voices about their NEWT exams. Regulus sat in an armchair by the window, advanced principles of Transfiguration resting against his knees. He sensed someone at the entrance and looked up. Severus Snape stood there, tall and motionless, like a shadow that had learned how to take shape. Snape did not step inside. He remained at the doorway, his dark eyes fixed in Regulus's direction. Their gazes met. Snape gave the faintest nod, so slight it was almost imperceptible, then turned and left. Regulus closed his book and followed. The corridor outside lay empty. Snape waited in the shadows at a corner, leaning against the stone wall, fingers unconsciously brushing the handle of his wand. "Black," Snape said quietly. "Snape." The exchange was brief. Snape stepped out from the shadows, his eyes sweeping both ends of the corridor to ensure they were alone before he spoke again. "The atmosphere among the upper years, it's off." Regulus waited. "There have been gatherings over the past few weeks," Snape continued carefully, glancing down the corridor once more. "Not official ones. Small classrooms. Empty rooms on the 8th floor. I'm half-blood, so I wouldn't normally qualify, but someone vouched for me." He paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Professor Slughorn mentioned my talent in potions. A few 7th years know about it. They needed someone to handle certain materials, so they brought me in. In exchange, I'm allowed to sit in." Regulus gave a small nod. That made sense. Snape's value lay in his ability. The pure-blood circles might be arrogant, but they were not foolish enough to waste useful talent. "They're discussing," Snape said, lowering his voice further, "cleaning out the trash." "Trash." Regulus repeated the word silently. He did not need clarification. Muggleborns. Those deemed to have tainted magical bloodlines. "Any concrete plans?" he asked. "Not yet." Snape shook his head. "It's more the atmosphere. A kind of urgency. A sense that they're meant to do something significant. The rhetoric's becoming more extreme. The attitudes more fanatical. Some mention support from their families. Others hint at the will of higher powers." "Higher powers? Voldemort? Are they planning to act within Hogwarts?" Regulus asked, his tone level. "Possibly." Snape hesitated. "Or maybe this is preparation. Shaping their attitudes. Aligning their thinking. So when they graduate and formally join, they're already properly molded." Regulus fell silent. He could picture it clearly. A group of 16 and 17-year-old pure-blood boys, steeped in family pride and blood supremacy, stirred by Voldemort's ideology and convinced they were part of something grand. Purifying the magical world. Erasing impurities. Fanaticism spread easily in closed circles. It created echo chambers where only one voice remained. "We are right. We are righteous. Opposition is evil." When an individual dissolved into a group, personal responsibility thinned. Moral hesitation weakened. The collective will replaced individual judgment. And when that collective will grew extreme, people would do things they might never consider alone, not because they had suddenly turned cruel, but because they no longer felt like individuals. They were pieces of a greater cause. A cause rooted in hatred and violence. "Why tell me?" Regulus asked. Snape pressed his lips together. After several seconds, he said one word. "Evans. Lily Evans." Muggleborn and Gryffindor. Would she become a target? Not necessarily. Not yet. But if the atmosphere continued to harden, every Muggleborn would eventually be treated as an enemy. Words would give way to exclusion. Exclusion would escalate into sabotage. Sabotage would turn into open hostility. Snape did not care about most Muggleborns. Immersed in that environment, even he might grow radical. But he cared about Lily. And he understood that he could not protect her alone. He needed allies, someone stronger and someone with status. Regulus Black fit that description. And the Christmas gift exchange had proven something else. Regulus honored his bargains and paid fairly. "The potion formula you gave me last time was useful," Snape said, locking eyes with him as if offering justification. "And that dark spell helped me understand a few things." He was offering goodwill. Information in exchange for knowledge and resources. Regulus could see the tension beneath Snape's composure. He inclined his head slightly. "I'll keep watch. If you hear more, tell me. You know the rate." Snape's eyes flickered with brief satisfaction before settling back into their usual gloom. "Understood." He hesitated. "Evans." Regulus regarded him calmly, his expression unreadable. Snape waited. When no answer came at once, he seemed ready to turn away. Then Regulus gave the slightest nod. Barely perceptible. For a fleeting moment, gratitude flashed across Snape's face, tinged with something like embarrassment. He said nothing further and left without another word. Regulus remained where he was, turning over what he had learned. Something was brewing within Slytherin. It might not yet be a concrete plan, but it was ideological preparation. Voldemort did not merely need enforcers. He needed believers. Hogwarts was the incubator. Slytherin the testing ground. If pureblood heirs began absorbing the ideology within school walls, by the time they graduated, they would already be fully formed Death Eaters in spirit. This kind of ideological infiltration was more dangerous than overt violence. Violence invited resistance. It exposed itself. It drew the attention of Dumbledore and the Ministry of Magic. But ideas spread quietly. Slowly. Like a frog in warming water. By the time anyone noticed, an entire generation of pureblood wizards might have accepted that logic as natural. Regulus returned to the common room. For now, he had no intention of intervening. It was not his responsibility. If the pureblood zealots wished to posture and whisper, that was their affair, so long as it did not touch him. Still, information held value. Knowing what others intended was always better than ignorance. He settled back into his armchair, the book open on his knees, though his eyes no longer followed the text. During the earlier Quidditch match conflict, he had stepped forward for a reason. That moment had been calculated. A performance. A demonstration aimed at potential observers like Dumbledore, Voldemort, and the pureblood families. He had shown composure and control. The ability to steady a volatile situation. That kind of display was not mere strength. It suggested leadership. The capacity to maintain order within chaos. Voldemort required fighters, yes, but he also needed those who could manage fighters. If the House of Black produced only reckless warriors, its value would be limited. But if it produced someone capable of consolidating power and stabilizing internal dynamics, that was far more significant. The Quidditch incident had been a controlled exhibition. What Snape described now was different. This was not a single clash. It was long-term ideological shaping. The older students might not act immediately, but the atmosphere would spread. It would seep into conversations, into attitudes. Today it might be verbal exclusion. Tomorrow, subtle sabotage. Eventually, open aggression. Regulus considered the motives. Some of it could be spontaneous. A handful of adolescent boys intoxicated by blood supremacy rhetoric and convinced they were destined to cleanse the magical world. Self-righteousness could easily mutate into extremism. More likely, their families were involved. Encouraging them to rehearse ideology at school, preparing them for eventual initiation into the Death Eaters. Direct orders from Voldemort seemed unlikely at this stage. The Dark Lord would not concern himself with student squabbles. His focus would be on recruiting adult wizards and advancing broader operations. Still, the ideology spreading among these students almost certainly traced back to him, passed down through Death Eater families to the next generation. Regulus chose observation. He was no savior. He had no obligation to shield every Muggleborn, so long as the conflict did not spill into his own affairs. As for Lily Evans, he shook his head faintly. The greatest harm she would suffer at Hogwarts might come from you calling her mudblood yourself, Snape. Room of requirement. Training chamber. Regulus stood in the center of the room, a silver sickle balanced on his palm. Space warp. His perception expanded. The structure of space revealed itself in a web-like pattern within his mind. The sickle's node stood out, clear and distinct. He focused. Magic flowed along the subtle grain of space, extending, guiding. The coin vanished. It reappeared 3 meters away on the wooden floor. Regulus walked over to examine the result. The landing point had deviated about 40 centimeters from his intended target. An improvement. Last time, the error had been 50. The sickle's surface felt warm to the touch, a residual heat from spatial friction. There was progress. The distance had increased. The margin of error had decreased. The magical cost had not fallen, but control had grown more refined. He picked up the coin and slipped it back into his pocket. His family was wealthy, but that did not mean he should waste money. Chapter 84, Bellatrix. Regulus walked to the corner of the training room. A few objects were laid out there, a palm-sized stone, a glass bottle, and an old key. They were props for practicing the space anchor charm. He had fully digested the inherited knowledge. He understood the principles now, truly understood them, and had built a complete framework in his mind. Regulus closed his eyes and let his awareness sink inward. In that inner space, he had constructed something like a library catalog. Each category of knowledge had its own section. Every book had its place. Verdant magic occupied one wing. Spatial magic another. Transfiguration theory had its own shelves. Dark magic was separate. Standard spells had their own orderly rows. Cross-references connected them. There were pathways linking related concepts. It was not some mystical memory palace. It was simple information management. Organize the chaos. Sort it. Connect it. Make retrieval effortless. Like a potions cabinet. Every ingredient stored in its assigned compartment. When needed, you reached for it directly instead of rummaging through clutter. The system required upkeep. New knowledge had to be categorized, linked, woven into the existing structure. Updates meant revisions across connected fields. But it was efficient. Before, recalling a spell's detail meant searching through memory. Now, he only had to focus on the right section. The information surfaced instantly. Regulus opened his eyes and raised his wand. Space anchor charm. Magic flowed from the tip, tightening into focus. Half a meter in front of him, the air condensed into an invisible point. The anchor formed. It could not be seen, but it could be felt. The spatial structure at that point had been nailed in place, unnaturally stable. He cast Wingardium Leviosa toward the anchored space. The spell worked, but its effect dulled. The quill rose 1/3 slower than usual, and when it drifted near the anchor, it trembled faintly. It worked. The anchor interfered with spatial structure. It indirectly affected any magic that relied on spatial stability. Apparition, port keys, even the transmission path of ordinary spells would be disrupted if they passed through the anchor's range. But maintaining it required constant magic. Right now, he could sustain 3 at most, each for 10 minutes. In real combat, he would have to choose. Spend magic maintaining anchors, or unleash offensive spells directly. Either way, he needed more practice. He dismissed the anchor and moved to the training dummy. Star-guided meditation began to turn. 4 stars lit within his awareness. He felt the starlight that had traveled billions of years through cold emptiness. He sensed the slow drift of constellations across the universe. The vastness, and his own smallness within it. Then he cast, Incendio. His wrist turned slightly, wand tracing an arc. In his mind, he pictured a supernova. The final blaze at the end of a star's life. An instant releasing more energy than its entire lifetime combined. Flames burst from the wand tip. They were no longer the usual orange-red. They burned white, incandescent and searing, hissing as they tore through the air. The fire did not stream forward in a steady jet. It detonated outward. It struck the dummy. The leather surface carbonized instantly, blackened but never truly ignited. The heat was too extreme. It burned straight through. A fist-sized hole opened in the dummy's chest. The edges were clean. The wood inside had already turned to ash. The air in the room grew stifling. The magic cost was triple that of a standard fire spell. Regulus lowered his wand and studied the hole. The power was astonishing. The cost was worse. 3 times the expenditure, far greater than Protego. It required deep meditation to prepare. In real combat, he would rarely have the chance to use it. But it was possible. When emotion and imagery intertwined with structured spell work, mutation occurred. He just needed balance. A balance between power and cost. Between the depth of imagery and the speed of invocation. He sat down and began to think. He thought about the inherited magic he had just absorbed. The memories within the crystal spheres were not simple knowledge transfer. They carried ancestral insight, experience, even traces of soul imprints. That required extraordinary magical mastery and strength of soul. The ancestor who created a legacy had to refine a lifetime of learning into its purest essence, seal it into crystal, and ensure the recipient could safely receive it. Not every family could accomplish that. The Blacks were ancient, with deep foundations. Only that was why several inheritances remained. Other families might have them. Or they might not. Even if they did, such things would be the highest secrets, never spoken of. He himself had not known his family possessed inherited magic until he was told. To obtain another family's inheritance was nearly impossible. Unless the family fell. Or the inheritance was lost. Or it was taken by force. Voldemort could certainly do it. With his power, forcing a family to surrender its inheritance would hardly be difficult. A thought flickered through Regulus's mind. If one day he needed knowledge from another family's inheritance, what would he do? Coerce them? Tempt them? Negotiate? Or wait for them to offer it willingly? He did not know. But for now, his paths to power were abundant. The Black family inheritance. The Hogwarts library. Guidance from professors. His own research and practice. Then another thought came to him. What could he leave behind for the House of Black? Regulus rose and walked toward the door. It was still early. He was only 12. His magical journey had barely begun. One day, when he was truly powerful, when he had developed his own understanding and creations, perhaps he too would leave an inheritance. Perhaps he would not repeat the path of his ancestors. Perhaps he would carve a new one. He pushed the door open. The walls of the room of requirement sealed behind him. The corridor lay empty. The castle slept. The feeling of having fully digested the inheritance was unmistakable. It was like setting down a heavy burden he had carried for too long. His mind felt lighter and sharper. The knowledge that had once been forced into him now belonged to him. He could call on it freely. Reflect on it deeply. Extend it. Create from it. He suspected his father had received an inheritance as well. As head of the Black family, Orion Black would not be ignorant of such things. But what exactly it was, whether he truly had, his father had never said. Regulus had never asked. In time, he would know. Late in January, deep night. In the training room of the Room of Requirement, Regulus sat cross-legged at the center of the floor and closed his eyes. Star-guided meditation turned. Orion spread across his awareness. The 3 belt stars, Alatok, Alnilam, and Mintaka, shone steadily, forming the framework. Betelgeuse burned at the upper left, red light fluctuating, brightening, and dimming, representing change and eruption. The 4-star system circulated smoothly. Magic cycled along the stellar paths. With each revolution, his body was tempered a fraction. His mind strengthened a degree. His total magic increased, imperceptibly but steadily. Now he would attempt to ignite the 5th star for the 2nd time. Bellatrix. Orion's left shoulder. Blue-white. In the star chart, it symbolized the warrior, the guardian, the boundary. Regulus focused. In his awareness, he constructed a model of Bellatrix, its position, its brightness, its relationship to the other 4 stars, its orbital trajectory. The model formed successfully. But ignition failed again. The second failure felt clearer than the first. His magic was sufficient. His mind was steady. But something did not align. Bellatrix's symbolic meaning did not match his current state of mind. That star required the will to guard. The resolve to stand firm for something, or someone. What did he guard? The answer came immediately. He guarded himself. His magical path. His family's interests. But those were benefits, not belief. Bellatrix demanded something different. A conviction-level defense. The choice to stand firm even when the cost exceeded the gain. Regulus could not do that. Not yet. He stopped trying and instead recalled how he had ignited Betelgeuse. Back then, he had not thought deeply about astronomy. He only knew it was a red supergiant, a variable star, destined to explode. It represented instability, but tremendous power. At the time, irritation and aggression had churned within him. Pressure from Bella's letters. Residual emotion after battle. That unstable yet potent state resonated with Betelgeuse, and ignition had followed. But after summoning a patroness during the holiday, after experiencing the power of the mind's light, after Professor Flitwick guided him to accept magic's irrational side. Perhaps he had been approaching this wrong. Igniting a star was not about building a model and pouring magic into it. It was about finding resonance between inner state and symbolic meaning. Understanding this, Regulus relaxed. He stopped forcing Bellatrix's model into place. He sensed Orion as a whole instead. The steady belt. The eruption of Betelgeuse. And the empty left shoulder. There should be a star there. One that bore defensive responsibility. The shield of the constellation. He imagined what that star should feel like. A concrete vow of protection? No. Something more abstract. The posture of standing one's ground. Like a castle wall. Like a boundary stone at the edge of a nation. Like the sky itself, never striking first, but anything that trespassed would meet an invisible barrier. As the image deepened, it resonated with something buried in the furthest reaches of his heart. Chapter 85, 4.5 stars. Regulus wanted to protect his path of exploration from interference. He wanted to protect the family's businesses from being plundered. He wanted to protect the clear understanding of this world he had maintained since crossing over, to keep it from being tainted by fanaticism and ignorance. He wanted to protect the purity inside his own heart. But this was not the power of the soul. It was not an emotional vow of protection. It was rational. He was protecting his own space to survive and grow. The next instant, resonance formed. In his awareness, the position of Bellatrix glowed faintly. Unlike the other 4 fully ignited stars, this was only a preparatory state, like a newly lit hearth that still needed more fuel before it could blaze. For now, this was as far as he could go. He could not give more than that. Regulus seized that state and linked the faint light of Bellatrix to the 4-star system. Originally, the 4-star system had been an inner cycle of stable foundation and explosive change. Now, with Bellatrix added, it became stable foundation, explosive change, and a defensive framework. Bellatrix did not grant additional magic. It strengthened structure. The entire system felt more solid, more capable of resisting external impact. The moment Bellatrix connected successfully, Regulus felt a tremor ripple through his magic. His total magic did not increase. But something had shifted. Control became more precise and the magic flow became steadier. He opened his eyes, raised his wand, and, riding the tremor of magic and the updated system, tried to bypass deep meditation and directly invoke the explosive imagery of Betelgeuse. Reducto. The curse shot forward and struck the stone wall opposite him. There was no expected explosion. Instead, spiderweb cracks spread across the impact point. Then the entire section of wall shattered silently into fist-sized chunks of stone, clattering to the floor. The power was 3 times that of a standard reductor curse. The cost had only increased by 50%. It was progress. Less waste, greater force. But a wave of weakness followed. Mental exhaustion. Calling upon Betelgeuse's explosive imagery without deep meditation required intense focus and will. It drained the mind quickly. That single strike had consumed roughly 1/10 of his mental strength. He could not use it often. Not yet. After one use, he would need time to recover, or it would affect subsequent spell casting and thought. He steadied his breathing and considered the improvement. Star-guided meditation had completely become his own. What he had first learned from astrological meditation remained only as a skeleton. Everything else had been replaced and refined. The 4-star system, plus the preparatory 5th, was unique. Perfectly aligned with his magical philosophy and inner state. He felt more certain than ever. Magical cultivation was not just the accumulation of knowledge and technique. It was resonance between the inner self and the outer world. Reason determined direction. Emotion supplied momentum. Only together could one go further. Regulus put away his wand and left the room of requirement. The corridor was silent. The castle slept under the night sky. He returned to the Slytherin dormitory. Cuthbert and Alex were already asleep. Hermes's bed was empty. He washed, lay down, and closed his eyes. Star-guided meditation turned on its own. The 4 stars revolved slowly in the depths of his awareness. At Bellatrix's position, a faint glimmer waited for the day it would truly ignite. In the first week of February, a light, restless excitement began to flow through the corridors of Hogwarts. Next weekend, 3rd years and above would be allowed to visit Hogsmeade. Older students were planning butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks. Middle years were discussing new sweets at Honeydukes. The younger ones could only listen, their faces caught between envy and anticipation. After Charms class, Regulus was stopped at a corridor corner by Lucretius Burke. Hogsmeade weekend next week. Lucretius's fingers brushed the edge of his prefect badge. His voice was low. Our shops recently acquired some interesting items. I mentioned before that you should come take a look. This is the perfect opportunity. Regulus lifted his head and met his gaze. It had been barely over a month since he had accepted the invitation in the Slytherin common room. Back then, he had said he would visit during the holiday. Now, only a few weeks into the new term, Lucretius had brought it up again. This time, he sounded more direct. More urgent. Had something changed? My father is looking forward to it, Lucretius added. Regulus nodded. He knew he meant the elder Burke. I'll need written permission from home. Of course. Lucretius's lips curved in a precise smile. Procedure must be followed. I'll be waiting at the Hogsmeade entrance. He left decisively, clearly confident Regulus would accept. Regulus watched him go and thought, if I refused, how would you respond? Back in the Slytherin dormitory, he sat at his desk and spread out parchment. He dipped his quill in ink. The tip hovered for a moment before he began to write. Father. Lucretius Burke has again invited me to visit Borgin and Burke's during next weekend's Hogsmeade trip. It has been just over a month since the previous invitation. I require a signed permission letter to apply to Professor Slughorn. Additionally, the Burke's attitude seems to have shifted. Has anything occurred recently? Please advise. Regulus. He finished, pressed the family seal at the bottom, imprinting the black crest, then went to the Oloi and handed the letter to his owl. Deliver it directly to father. At breakfast the next morning, a family owl landed beside Regulus and dropped a reply. The parchment was thick, its edges gilded. Orion Black's handwriting was steady and restrained. Regulus. Permission enclosed. I will inform Professor Slughorn separately. Regarding the Burkes, 2 weeks ago, the Ministry of Magic suddenly established a special review office for dark artifacts, led directly by Barty Crouch of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The review covers all registered transactions involving dark artifacts, with particular focus on cursed and large-scale destructive items. Borgin and Burke specializes in such goods and is naturally the primary target. The review has not yet expanded to Nocturne Alley, but pressure is already spreading. The Burkes seek to establish contact with me through you, to secure buffering at the level of the Wiesengamot or early warning. This is a transaction, not a favor. Your visit signals the House of Black's willingness to engage. Specific terms will be negotiated between myself and the elder Burke. Additionally, instability has arisen in Nocturne Alley due to the review. Some holders of sensitive items are eager to dispose of them. Conflicts have increased. When you go, enter only the shop. Do not linger in the alley. Regulus folded the letter and tucked it into his inner pocket. The ministry had acted suddenly. Barty Crouch, known for his severity and efficiency in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A man who would one day send his own son to Azkaban, later smuggle him out by sacrificing his wife, and eventually die at that same son's hand. An operation like this did not happen without cause. Either someone at the top was pushing, or something significant had forced a response. Regulus considered the possibilities. Perhaps Voldemort's influence was expanding faster, and the circulation of dark artifacts had increased to a level the ministry could no longer ignore. Perhaps Dumbledore's faction had exerted pressure within the Wiesengamot to restrict the dark trade. Or perhaps Crouch himself was accumulating political capital, laying groundwork for a future bid for Minister for Magic. Regulus understood the general ecology of British wizarding politics. Factions everywhere. Interests exchanged beneath the surface. The law looked formidable on paper, but enforcement often had flexibility. Pure-blood families had cultivated the ministry for generations. There were people in every department. Usually, reviews of this kind came with advance notice. This time, there had been no warning. Unusual. Either Crouch had bypassed conventional channels and acted directly, or the decision-making level was high enough that even pure-blood families had no access. The latter seemed unlikely. The British ministry did not possess that kind of untouchable upper tier. Either way, the situation was shifting. Regulus finished breakfast and left the Great Hall. After afternoon classes, he would need to see Professor Slughorn. At 4 o'clock, he knocked on the door of the potions office. "Come in." Slughorn's cheerful voice called from inside. The office was unchanged. The air carried the mixed fragrance of expensive potion ingredients. The walls were lined with photographs of famous witches and wizards. Silver instruments gleamed on the desk. Rare materials filled the shelves. Near the fireplace, a small round table held half a bottle of mead and several plates of sweets. Professor Slughorn sat in a wide armchair, holding a thick leather ledger. The moment he saw Regulus, his eyes lit up. "Regulus." He set the ledger aside and beckoned warmly. "What an honor. Let me think, this is your first voluntary visit this term, isn't it?" Regulus stepped forward and greeted him politely. "Professor." Sit. Slughorn beamed and waved his hand. The chair opposite slid out on its own. "I've just received your father's letter." He laid the parchment down gently, wearing a knowing smile. "I'm aware of the Hogsmeade matter. The application form is right here, already signed." He pushed the form across the desk. "Procedure observed. I'll handle the rest. Off you go." Regulus thanked him courteously, exchanged farewells, and left the office.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.